Howdy, I'm Nolan, and you know what kinda sucks? Humanity's very narrow ability to affect anything outside of the present. We spend so much time in the past thinking about things we should have done differently, could have done differently, and didn't, all of those things, and then we spend maybe even more time worrying about the future, things that we need to do or want to do, things that we plan for meticulously, and they still don't end up working out. The future specifically feels so far out of reach, so completely unknown and unknowable, and when we try to predict it ourselves and are wrong, it leaves us asking the question, how do people do this all the time? Here's an example. I don't remember a whole lot of 2016. I was going through something, but I do remember how literally everything was apparently pictured in The Simpsons like 20 years earlier. Like little stuff. I feel like I remember a picture of like a certain political figure on an elevator or an escalator. People started to say they had a time traveler in the writer's room, or that the government will dangle stuff in front of us to get us used to it. And that's well, point is, some people know what's up somehow. You probably hear it more often when people say things like, well, Orwell was spot on with 1984, or Bradbury was right on with Fahrenheit 451. But how did they get there? Well, they looked at the past. Both of these authors looked at real-world authoritarianism that happened in the past, and the things that they were writing about were direct responses to these real events. If you look at Fahrenheit 451, when were people in history burning books all the time? Well, where would Orwell have gotten Animal Farm or 1984 from? Well, real-world authoritarianism again. Then all these authors have to do is take these ideas and plaster them onto shiny futuristic settings, and when history inevitably repeats itself because people don't learn from mistakes and governments want you to forget bad stuff, they are hailed as prophets. And they're like, how could anyone have predicted this? Well, nobody's predicting anything. This is a train of thought that might lead me to get a little bit more cynical than I'd like to in this video. So I'm going to ask a different question. What about the literary works that haven't totally come true yet, but are really getting there? What about some literary works that play on modern fears and modern innovations, but were written so long ago? Well, here are 3 short stories that do just that. I picked them because they're not only just really well fitting to this topic, but also just well written and terribly interesting. They've all got these crazy endings that stick with you like a stab wound. Especially the last one, I think, is probably my favorite ending of the 3. And I think about them way more often than I should, so I would love to share them with you today. I'm going to give a guided summary of each story and then talk about some of the overall themes and how they relate to our present and perceived future, as well as the past events that may have inspired them, or just kind of the history going on at the time that they were written. That sounded a lot more structured than it will actually be. I'll kind of be doing all those things at once during the reading of the story. As a writing nerd, I will probably also just be talking about the techniques and the authors and rambling about how much I love them and everything. But, only the impure can find anger in their hearts towards a young man who loves too much. A link to everything I read will be in the description, in PDF form. I seriously encourage you guys to read these for yourself, as everything is up to interpretation. I'm only going to be talking about mine because it's the only one that I have, but I think that everyone should be able to read these and form their own opinions. I also just think it's important to read texts as they were written. I also will be dipping into some summary from time to time, and I'm going to try to read everything verbatim if I can, but we just don't have the time to read every single piece of original text. Although I will be summarizing, I promise you everything I read in this video is worth reading on your own in full, because every author has their own very unique voice and very unique prose, and they just have a lot to say that I'm going to be doing my best to translate, but I think that it's most evocative and most powerful in its original form. Without further ado, our first story of the day is Ray Bradbury's The Veldt. It was published in 1950, and it is only 13 pages long. It's somewhat dialogue heavy too, so those 13 pages go by really fast, and even the non-dialogue parts just go really fast. It's paced really well. It's super instantly captivating, and I love it a lot, so I'm going to be talking about it a lot. I actually am lucky enough to have this one physically in his collection, The Illustrated Man. Although in this it's called The Veld, V-E-L-D, and everywhere else it's called the V-E-L-D-T. So I don't know if that's like an American localization of the word or what's up with that. Maybe I got a misprint. Maybe I got a super rare edition. Anyway, for the sake of making everything universal, I'm going to be referring to it as the Velt, and the version that's going to be in the description refers to it as the Velt with a T. It begins with George and Lydia Hadley in some kind of an argument over their home's nursery, which is a totally normal thing for a couple to be having an argument about, especially a couple with young kids. But then Lydia suggests that they look for outside help from, of all things, a psychologist. George asks why, and Lydia tells him he knows why, and that the nursery is different than it was earlier. So they go take a look. This is when we're introduced to the story's main element. They walk down the hall of their soundproofed Happy Life home, which had cost them $30,000 installed. This house, which clothed and fed and rocked them to sleep, and played and sang and was good to them. Their approach sensitized a switch somewhere, and the nursery light flicked on when they came within 10 feet of it. Similarly, behind them, in the halls, lights went on and off as they left them behind with a soft automaticity. Well, first things first, I cannot believe I said the word automaticity first try. Oh, and I did it again! George and Lydia live in what we would now call a smart home. It does literally everything for them, even turning the lights on when they approach a certain room. My favorite part of this paragraph is the line, "and was good to them." I think it really personifies this house in a way that shows a nurturing relationship. It just feels kind of homey and sweet in a way. It feels nice, like it's personified exactly how I think a good home should be. I also really love that it only cost them $30,000. That's insane. Well, said George Hadley, they stood on the thatched floor of the nursery. It was 40 feet across by 40 feet long and 30 feet high. It had cost half again as much as the rest of the house. But nothing's too good for our children, George had said. The nursery was silent. It was empty as a jungle glade at hot high noon. The walls were blank and two-dimensional. Now, as George and Lydia Hadley stood in the center of the room, the walls began to purr and recede into crystalline distance, it seemed, and presently an African Velt appeared in 3 dimensions on all sides, in color reproduced to the final pebble and bit of straw. The ceiling above them became a deep sky with a hot yellow sun. George Hadley felt the perspiration start on his brow. "Let's get out of the sun," he said. "This feels a little too real, but I don't see anything wrong." "Wait a moment, you'll see," said his wife. Now, the hidden odorophonics were beginning to blow a wind of odor at the 2 people in the middle of the baked Veltland. The hot straw smell of lion grass, the cool green smell of the hidden waterhole, the great rusty smell of animals, the smell of dust like a red paprika in the hot air, and now the sounds, the thump of distant antelope feet on a grassy sod, the papery rustling of vultures. A shadow passed through the sky. Shadow flickered on George Hadley's upturned, sweating face. "Filthy creatures," he heard his wife say. "The vultures." So, we find out that the nursery is a simulated environment and that it does a great job of replicating its intended space. It even replicates heat and smells and discomforts George in the way that the environment would. The big thing to pay attention to here is that in this simulated environment, there are vultures. The existence of vultures quickly implies the existence of some sort of life cycle contained in the nursery, and we see that almost immediately. Lydia then mentions that there are lions far away feasting on something but unable to say for certain what. George looks and says it's too late to be certain what, indicating the state of their food, but that it may be a zebra or baby giraffe. Lydia recalls hearing a scream about a minute before that George did not catch. This is something for later. The next section is one of my favorites from all the Bradbury I've read, because it perfectly showcases his balance of direct explanation and finessed prose. I'll read it in full because you deserve to see what a master he is at commanding tone and image, though you are going to go read this for yourself after this video, right? The lions were coming. And again, George Hadley was filled with admiration for the mechanical genius who had conceived this room. A miracle of efficiency, selling for an absurdly low price. Every home should have one. Oh, occasionally they frightened you with their clinical accuracy. They startled you, gave you a twinge, but most of the time, what fun for everyone. Not only your own son and daughter, but for yourself when you felt like a quick jaunt to a foreign land, a quick change of scenery. Well, here it was. And here were the lions now, 15 feet away. So real, so feverishly and startlingly real that you could feel the prickling fur on your hand, and your mouth was stuffed with the dusty upholstery smell of their heated pelts, and the yellow of them was in your eyes like the yellow of an exquisite French tapestry. The yellows of lions and summer grass, and the sound of the matted lion lungs exhaling on the silent noontide, and the smell of meat from their panting, dripping mouths. The lions stood looking at George and Lydia Hadley with terrible green-yellow eyes. "Watch out!" screamed Lydia. The lions came running at them. Lydia bolted and ran. Instinctively, George sprang after her. Outside in the hall with the door slammed, he was laughing, and she was crying, and they both stood appalled at the other's reaction. "George!" "Lydia, oh my dear, poor sweet Lydia. They almost got us." "Walls, Lydia, remember. Crystal walls, that's all they are. Oh, they look real, I must admit. Africa in your parlor. But it's all dimensional, super reactionary, super sensitive color film and mental tape film behind glass screens. It's all odorophonics and sonics, Lydia. Here's my handkerchief." George blows off this horrible encounter with the lions with relative calm, reassuring his wife that it isn't real, even though he still sweated in the sun and it sure felt and even smells real. Keep this in mind, and as it's here we get to infer that George may be someone who doesn't often react to trouble with action, and that's going to be a big problem the whole rest of the story. In fact, his reaction is more of praise. He uses all the buzzwords, the correct terminology, almost as if he's advertising to his wife, and somewhat to us as the reader, how great this room is. Despite the fear this experience instilled in his wife, who he calls his poor sweet Lydia, alluding to the fact that he does care about her, George is still very proud of this room, refusing to identify a fault with it. He's too stubborn, too proud. Lydia speaks next. "I'm afraid." She came to him and put her body against him and cried steadily. "Did you see? Did you feel? It's too real. Now, Lydia, you've got to tell Wendy and Peter not to read any more on Africa." And suddenly, the heart of the story is beating even stronger. We learn several vitally important things from this one sentence. Point 1. The Hadleys have 2 children, Wendy and Peter. I believe these names were intentionally chosen to invoke the characters from Peter Pan. Though the movie wouldn't have come out for another 3 years after the Velt's release, the characters have existed since 1904 in play form and since 1911 in novel form. The novel even is simply called Peter and Wendy. I really don't think that Bradbury would use these names unless it was meant to evoke Neverland. They're just too iconic. It'd be like naming characters Mickey and Minnie and then be like, no, it's not about the mouse. It's nothing like that. This is important to mention because I think the themes of Peter Pan are the protection and elongation of childhood, the innocence and the imagination and creativity of the characters in the book. This is something that's going to be kind of subverted in the Velt. So I think that it's incredibly intentional to act as a kind of perversion of theme. Point 2. If Peter and Wendy need to stop reading about Africa, then Peter and Wendy are reading age. This is kind of a minor one, but it is important. You get to know their exact age later, but right now we don't know anything about them other than that it's a nursery. And when I hear nursery, I think of younger kids, like infants to toddler age. So for the nursery to be, for kids who can read at a high enough level to really understand the environment of Africa, and maybe they're older. I looked it up, and nursery wasn't like a broader term in the 50s, because I know that kind of happens sometimes. And point 3, and this is the kicker, this is the big one. Whatever the kids read, the room reflects. That's a big responsibility. Now, I'm not anybody's dad, but personally, I would definitely keep kids away from books about places or things that would appear in my house if I didn't want those things in my house. The only lions I want in my house are from Detroit. Having like an actual African Sahara like desert area would be terrifying. And if you know that that's what's gonna happen if your kids are reading it, why aren't you protecting your kids in your house? From there, Lydia asks George to lock the nursery, and George reminds her that the last time they tried that, Peter threw a horrible tantrum when it was only closed for a few hours. Then he says, and Wendy too, they live for the nursery. This line is like a 1-inch punch in word form, which I think is Bradbury's signature almost. He's really good at the like short kind of things that just, oh my gosh. Even without really knowing all that much about the kids yet, we know how bad this implication is. That is a deep darkness in only 5 words. And it only gets darker the more and more we get into the story. But before we can really unlock that depth, let's keep building on George and Lydia. Lydia says the nursery has to be locked up no matter what. And George reluctantly agrees, telling her that she's been working too much. We don't get to see exactly what he means, but I found this to be further proof that George is almost willingly out of touch. Lydia can't exactly be working too much when the house does all her work for her. In fact, the next section is all about that. This is about to be a lot of reading, but it's all very necessary, and it's another testament to Bradbury's efficiency. I don't know, she said, blowing her nose, sitting down in a chair that immediately began to rock and comfort her. Maybe I don't have enough to do. Maybe I have time to think too much. Why don't we shut the whole house off for a few days and take a vacation? You mean you want to fry my eggs for me? Yes, she nodded. And darn my socks? Yes. A frantic, watery-eyed nodding. And sweep the house? Yes, oh yes. But I thought that's why we bought this house, so we wouldn't have to do anything. That's just it. I feel like I don't belong here. The house is wife and mother now, and nursemaid. Can I compete with an African Velt? Can I give a bath and scrub the children as efficiently or quickly as the automatic scrub bath can? I cannot. And it isn't just me, it's you. You've been awfully nervous lately. I suppose I have been smoking too much. You look as if you don't know what to do with yourself in this house either. You smoke a little more every morning and drink a little more every afternoon, and need a little more sedative every night. You're beginning to feel unnecessary too. Am I? He paused and tried to feel into himself to see what was really there. There's a lot to break down here, so I'll just go top to bottom. First off, the chair starts rocking Lydia by itself. This is something I missed on my first read through. I have some difficulties with reading, as you'll probably get familiar with the more and more I read out loud on this channel. But there's a lot of like perversions of procedure that happen in this story. And those things are the things that really get me. Because when I'm used to reading a sentence like, she sat in the chair and started rocking herself. Totally cool. Because of the like jumbling and stuff that happens whenever I read a sentence, if I can see certain words, I can be like, okay, I know what's happening. I don't have to stress myself out with this. I think that's kind of a bad reading habit. I'm gonna try and stop doing that anymore. But the point is, when those sentences are mixed up in a way, like the chair started rocking her itself, I still have the mental note to myself, like, okay, I know what's happening. I don't need to reread the sentence 3 times before I understand. Wrong. I did need to read multiple times, and now I know that even in her sad moment about how little agency she has, she's giving up agency because the chair is rocking her. Lydia and George losing their agency and autonomy at any point in the story is important and very indicative of the world that they live in, but it's important especially in the middle of a conversation, or I guess at the beginning of a conversation, about how little agency they have. It's ironic, and it's a great show of just who the two of them are. They're so deeply attached to this house, and its procedures are so ingrained in them that they don't notice that the thing that they're talking about, the loss of their autonomy, is happening beneath them. In this passage, we also learn a very important detail, that the house can be shut off, and that they'd consider it a vacation. This possibly implies that they'd turn it back on, that even with their irritations, they're not willing to forego the convenience forever, which I think is a very real thing. Lydia tells George that she wants to do things for him again, and George seems happy with this, but then she admits that she just can't be as efficient or good at these things as the automatic house can. This may be our most explicit illustration of the main theme so far, that constant consumption and over-automation can take the art and the personability out of the mundane. Everyday tasks are some of my favorite things to write and read about, because I think a lot of beauty and meaning goes overlooked, and I think it's important to acknowledge these things. Lydia seems to be reaching towards this idea as well, but stopping herself from really grasping it. This is what I think a lot of people are doing with new technologies, and the main reason I wanted to include this story in this video. So many talented and capable people are stunting themselves with artificial intelligence, replacing their own thought and effort with a simple press of a button. People are reaching a point where they need chairs to rock them when they could just rock themselves, and it's because they've willingly relinquished their autonomy. Simple things like making lists or generating graphics, things you can do in seconds or with half an hour of self-instruction, are being given up for the sake of convenience. We're losing skills. We're losing art. We're losing the ability to express ourselves and to communicate, and I think it's because we don't think we have enough time to be human anymore. Over-automation doesn't make you a more efficient person, it makes you less of a person. And that's exactly what's happening to George and to Lydia. Bradbury perfectly predicted what's happening with people now that we're at a point where these inventions are on our doorstep, sometimes literally. Now, all we have left to do is be afraid. Because if he predicted the first part of the story right, then that means that he predicted the second part of the story right. And that is bad news. Now, when Lydia talks about the things that she's missing, she only ever mentions these kind of housewife duties. It's a reminder that although very progressive and prophetic for its time, this story is a product of the 50s. However, the way I'm reading it is that Lydia simply wants to demonstrate that she cares about the people around her through conducting acts of service, a means of expression that has been stolen from her by her house. It also showcases that, much like ours, this is a world that values productivity above all else. George feels similarly and admits that he's been nervous lately, smoking too much. Another absolute haunter of a sentence comes from Lydia, who tells her husband that he's beginning to feel unnecessary too. Whoa! In response to this, he has to question whether or not that's true, as if nothing prompted him to think or feel in quite some time. The lack of responsibility or action present in George's life has hollowed him. After a moment of thought, Lydia wonders if the lions can get out of the nursery, and while George is assuring her that they can't, the door shakes, as if something hits it from the inside, which is terrifying, but also further proof of George's disregard of facts. Later that night, George and Lydia eat dinner served from the inside of their dining room table. They're alone because the kids are at a plastic fair and have messaged to say that they'll be home late. This is a kind of subversion of family values, eating together and all that, especially in the 50s. When George points out that there's no ketchup, the table apologizes, which I think is really interesting. I think a lot about how AI models are programmed to be crazy polite so that people maintain the thought that they're in charge. I think some people only ever really use them because they like having control over a seemingly sentient being. Maybe that's a topic for another video, but the point is being polite is good for business for AI. George thinks about his time in the nursery/Velt, and recalls the heat of the sun and the unmistakable smell of blood. There's another passage here that I think is just brilliant. Obviously, I think everything is brilliant because I'm a dumb nerd and an unbeatable optimist, but seriously. Remarkable how the nursery caught the telepathic emanations of the children's minds and created life to fill their every desire. The children thought lions, and there were lions. The children thought zebras, and there were zebras. Sun, sun. Giraffes, giraffes. Death, and death. At last. He chewed tastelessly on the meat that the table had cut for him. Death thoughts. They were awfully young, Wendy and Peter, for death thoughts. Or, no, you were never too young, really. Long before you knew what death was, you were wishing it on someone else. When you were 2 years old, you were shooting people with cat pistols. But this, the long, hot African Velt, the awful death in the jaws of a lion, and repeated again and again. There aren't a whole lot of authors who can get away with two-word sentences, especially in a genre like science fiction, which is so constantly needing of context. Ray Bradbury does it anyway, and creates what I think is one of the most evocative moments in the whole story. George chews on a piece of machine-prepared meat and spirals downward to a point where his sentences are short and loose. The use of you in this section is super jarring, and I love it because it's very unsettling. It's just so perfect. The story is in this slightly detached third person the entire time, and then this sudden second person narration caught me super off guard in a really good and meaningful way. This is something I noticed a lot in Bradbury's work, especially in Something Wicked This Way Comes. He plays around a lot with perspective, not ever necessarily changing it from, first and third, or changing it from first person perspectives across different characters. he will just sometimes really get you in the mind of a character. He also uses form and grammar in some really unconventional ways that heighten the tone of every story just so much. The reason we can so easily enter George's mind is not because Bradbury followed rules, but rather because he broke them. When George starts to spiral, and so too do the grammar and rules of this story, we know him and we get to be him much more than if it was just all standard all the time. I promise I won't keep bringing this up, but again, with my reading difficulties, I get way thrown off when a story starts to use non-conditional rules. The rules are in place for a reason, and especially for people like me who can't read. Those rules guide me through sentences that I struggle with, and so for a rule to be broken, I'm usually like, oh no, I don't know what to do, I can't read anymore. But when Bradbury does it, especially in this context, I get thrown deeper into the story. It's just a masterful execution, and I think it takes a certain level of nuance to really be able to pull this off. George gets up from the table without even thinking. We only find this out because Lydia calls out to him, asking where he's going. He doesn't answer, but we know he's going to the nursery as he follows the roar of a lion, and hopefully that's not coming from anywhere else. He doesn't answer, but from the doorway he hears a faraway scream, which you should keep in mind, and another roar. He steps inside, and the African Veltlands appear just as they did before. He thinks about how the nursery used to appear as many different things, like Wonderland, Oz, and the world of Aladdin. He'd seen beautiful fantasies, and now he just sees the hot, hungry desert. It is then revealed that the nursery has been the Velt for a whole month, but that George had been busy and not paid it any attention, even though the smell of lions had reached as far as his study. George enters the nursery and tells the lions to go away. They happily oblige, trot off, and the story ends. No, I'm kidding. The lions don't care. George then calls out, begging the nursery to show him Aladdin and his lamp, trying to manifest his thoughts into reality, like the original intent of the room. Aladdin never shows, and neither does his lamp. The lions just watch. George then exits the nursery and tells his wife that the room is out of order, to which she responds, or what? Or it can't respond, said Lydia, because the children have thought about Africa and lions and killing so many days that the room's in a rut. Could be. Or Peter set it to remain that way. Set it? He may have gotten to the machinery and fixed something. Peter doesn't know machinery. He's a wise one for 10. That IQ of his. Nevertheless, George Hadley, if you are watching this, please start taking things seriously. Lydia raises the possibility that the room has been reprogrammed and that their son Peter is smart enough to achieve that. That's the good option, if you can believe that, because the other option is that the kids are so focused on blood and gore and animals killing each other that the room is just stuck. The conversation here is further proof that these two people are just very ineffective communicators, almost unable to feel, and just stuck on what should be rather than what is. It really reminds me of the Yorgos Lanthimos movie Killing of a Sacred Deer. It has this super surreal air to it. Colin Farrell and Nicole Kidman play parents in this movie, and while they do communicate about the insane circumstances that they find themselves in, they do so in a detached and unfeeling way, completely jarringly juxtaposed against the high stakes that are in their lives. We as viewers seem to be more afraid of the stakes than the people really feeling them, and the same can be said for George and for Lydia. I'd recommend the movie for a one-time watch, at least, because it's really good, but also I'd never want to watch that again. I've never felt like that in my entire life, and I kind of don't want to feel like that again. Anyway, time to get back to the story, because we have visitors. Hello, Mom. Hello, Dad. The Hadleys turned. Wendy and Peter were coming in the front door, cheeks like peppermint candy, eyes like bright blue agate marbles, a smell of ozone on their jumpers from their trip in the helicopter. You're just in time for supper, said both parents. We're full of strawberry ice cream and hot dogs, said the children, holding hands, but we'll sit and watch. What a strange thing to say. Not sit and talk, sit and visit, sit and watch? Sit and watch your parents have dinner? You're 10. This feels so foreign. But remember, these children's lives are defined by their drive to watch, not to experience. It's actually very important that they said it like that. They watch Oz, they watch Wonderland, they watch the Veldt, because it's easier and more fantastic than just going and experiencing something. Granted, they did just come back from a helicopter ride to the plastic fair, but what is that? I'd want to ask about that if I were George, but He's got other priorities, which fair. Yes, come tell us about the nursery, said George Hadley. The brother and sister blinked at them and then at each other. Nursery? All about Africa and everything, said the father with false joviality. I don't understand, said Peter. Your mother and I were just traveling through Africa with rod and reel. Tom Swift and his electrical lion, said George Hadley. There's no Africa in the nursery, said Peter simply. Oh, come now, Peter. We know better. I don't remember any Africa, said Peter to Wendy. Do you? Now, due to Lydia's previous comment about Peter's high IQ and just kind of his general tone throughout this conversation, I do not trust this little kid. A kid being too smart for their age has only ever been a good thing like twice in all of media history, and that's in A Wrinkle in Time and in Instagram clips of young Sheldon. Out of principle, I do not like this guy Peter, but that's really only half of what we gain from this passage. Honest or not, Peter claims that there is no Africa in the nursery. If Peter's telling the truth, then it means the nursery has been projecting something wrong to the parents, which is a breach of its programming. If he's lying, then he's clearly manipulating his parents in a long, thought-out way. This is a very ugly coin we're flipping, and I love that. There's uncertainty here, and there's lack in clarity, in tone, and intent. It's a perfect illustration of how dehumanized and disconnected people have become in this world. People become what they surround themselves with. And when you surround yourself with the artificial, the sycophantic, with the manipulative, you aren't just being lied to. You aren't just being wasted and betrayed. You become the betrayer. You become the liar, the manipulator, the sycophant, the computer, the husk in the shell, and the crystalline walls that reflect nothing. And yet, somehow, the lions, your lions, they won't budge. And they have a look in their eye that tells you that despite the fact they don't have teeth or mouths or throats or stomachs, beyond the digital recreation, they do have a hunger. We haven't seen anything yet. Peter tells Wendy to run and check the nursery for Africa. She obeys and succeeds because George forgot to lock the room after he had his last look at it, which is to be expected when you're used to doors locking themselves, I guess. While Wendy goes on ahead, Peter reassures his father that they haven't seen Africa, but George insists, and when Wendy comes back to tell them that the veldt isn't in there, George goes to check for himself. There was a green, lovely forest, a lovely river, a purple mountain, high voices singing, and Rima, lovely and mysterious, lurking in the trees with colorful flights of butterflies, like animated bouquets lingering in her long hair. The African veltland was gone. The lions were gone. Only Rima was here now, singing a song so beautiful that it brought tears to your eyes. The nursery is no longer the landscape of brutality, but is instead this picture of lush fertility, of growth and peace. The word lovely is repeated 3 times, emphasizing that the beauty of this place is simple and instinctive. It seems as though our narrator is lost for words about it, repeating the same thing over and over. Again, this is Bradbury so simply placing us in a closer perspective, what the author John Gardner would call the psychic distance. Sometimes when an experience is so overwhelming, you have to use the same word over and over because it really is just that one thing to you. This is, again, something I believe is hard to pull off. Repeated words and terms bug me a lot most of the time, but Bradbury does it right. There's creative intent here, whether I'm making it up or not. But hey, some would say that intent dies when it leaves the hands of the maker, so whatever. Now, I don't know about you guys, maybe this is super popular and I'm just living under a rock, but I did not know who Rima was when I first read this. I could tell that she was maybe a pre-established character, but I wasn't sure from what or what her connotation is besides being, quote, lovely. After a tiny bit of research, I found out that she's Rima the Jungle Girl and originated in the 1904 novel Green Mansions, A Romance of the Tropical Forest by W.H. Hudson. This is the same year that Peter and Wendy debuted. This seems at first like maybe just a niche reference, but there's a deeper context here that I missed on my first couple reads. The veldt is supposed to be set 100 years after its publishing date, so 2050. With the way technology is progressing, I think it's entirely realistic to say that some people will have technology like the nursery in their homes by that year. I don't think it's entirely realistic to say that the 10-year-old children of 2050 will be reading stories from 1904, and not just because I think Gen Alpha will be the last generation who knows how to read. I think the implication here is that Peter and Wendy have to grow up on century-and-a-half-old stories because due to automation, people aren't writing stories anymore. They're just doing nothing. In a perfect world, AI might do tasks like the dishes and the laundry. I'd argue that even these chores should be done by hand, not just to ensure accuracy, but because there's something a bit meditative in cleaning. The point is, ideally, AI takes the tasks we don't want to do so that we can do the ones we do want to do. AI makes all the spreadsheets so that we can paint and write, but as we now know, the opposite is true. In an over-automated world, it unfortunately is very realistic to assume that nobody would be writing any stories anymore. It would have been crazy if Bradbury had suggested this more explicitly, because nobody would ever believe that people would use AI for telling stories and making art so that they could spend more time with doing their spreadsheets or whatever it is people do at real jobs. So Peter and Wendy have to grow up reading the same stories that their great-grandparents did, because nobody else is writing anything new. I actually missed this idea entirely earlier with the mention of Aladdin, because when I think of Aladdin, I think of the Disney movie. The one and only Disney movie. They only made the one. Aladdin, to me, because of this movie, still has cultural relevance. So I had no problem thinking, oh yeah, sure, the kids will know Aladdin. Everybody knows Aladdin. I know Aladdin. This was, of course, not the intent, though, as Ray Bradbury was just a bit earlier with this story than Disney was with Aladdin. I think that implication is one of the more important parts of the paragraph, but there's another very important part, and that is that the line brought tears to your eyes. This is another use of the second person, much smoother and much easier to digest, since we've already eased into a new perspective throughout the paragraph. However, the perspective isn't the part that I wanted to talk about. I more so wanted to mention that we know that the nursery, despite being artificial, is powerful and is evocative. Of course, we saw the fear and the physical reaction that it can instill earlier with the odorophonics, and the heat from the sun, but to know that it can create something so beautiful that you could cry is very important to know as well. The nursery is skilled in a way, but we already knew that. What this really tells us is that George, though aloof and stubborn, is not completely devoid of feeling. Art and nature still have a power over George, even if it is de-emphasized. I have a tough mental argument with myself over whether or not this is still true, as I think a lot of the AI bros of today couldn't be moved by any piece of art that isn't like a burning dollar or something. Upon seeing this lovely forest, George almost immediately tells the kids to just go to bed. They start to protest, but he stops it, and the kids walk into the air closet, where a wind sucks them through a tube to their slumber rooms. This is all talked about very nonchalantly, very naturally, which I actually think is the key to why it works. I've read a lot of sci-fi and fantasy that I don't enjoy as much because it spends too much time telling you directly or indirectly about its systems, about what makes it different from real life, and I think that it pulls me out. So I really like the application of these ideas in this story. I think it's very smooth. I really don't like when the story tries too hard to explain itself. It pulls me out. It reminds me that I'm reading something. That's what I really don't like. So when a sci-fi or fantasy story just confidently injects its elements throughout the whole thing and puts it into the reality, not of my world, but of the world that the characters are in, I just feel a whole lot better. It feels smoother. If a character without any fuss or uncertain explanation gets sucked up through an air closet, I'm like, okay, yeah, I know what an air closet is now. It sucks you up. But if a character, for example, steps into a 2x2 metal room with vents and white lights, and suddenly they feel a rise in their feet, they recognize this as the air closet. It's a technology they've had for 20 years in their house. Get me out? I don't like that. I'm out. Kids leave. George re-enters the nursery, followed by Lydia, who stands in the entrance. In the part of the room which formerly housed the lions, he finds an old wallet of his. It smells like hot grass and lion fur, and it's covered in saliva, bite marks, and blood. He leaves and locks the nursery tightly behind him. In bed, both George and Lydia are having trouble sleeping, so they start talking, and both admit they think that Wendy changed the room when she went ahead, but also that they don't know why she did this. Lydia asks how George's wallet got in there, and he says he doesn't know again, and that he's beginning to be sorry we bought that room for the children. If children are neurotic at all, a room like that, but Lydia interrupts and says it's supposed to help them work off their neuroses in a healthful way. George says he's starting to wonder. So now we get to see Lydia engage in the denial that we've been watching George have the whole time, and again, it's this kind of science-backed rebuttal. Earlier, George was citing the specs of the room as a way to back up its safety, and now Lydia is doing the same, almost as if they're regurgitating an advertisement. This is really smart writing in my opinion, as it tells us a lot about the world, and we're able to grasp this information because it's already so real. A lot of people just repeat information that they've heard other people say without processing it themselves. And so for Lydia to just quote the ad and not take her personal experiences into account makes a lot of sense and really furthers the anti-industrialization and anti-capitalist message that the whole story has. Why would a nice company lie to me, right? I also think it's really interesting that neurosis gets brought up here. It's another little foresight prophecy kind of moment, as we now know that screen time is really bad for kids. I couldn't find a whole lot of data about this from the 50s, from any time that Bradbury would have been able to know this, but studies have shown that it's very dangerous and can even increase things like a neurosis and apathy and bad behavior in children. It may be a little reductive to call what happens in the nursery screen time. I think that's oversimplifying it a bit, but you do know what I mean. Back to the story now. We've given the children everything they ever wanted. Is this our reward? Secrecy? Disobedience? Who was it said children are carpets? They should be stepped on occasionally. We've never lifted a hand. They're insufferable, let's admit it. They come and go when they like. They treat us as if we were offspring. They're spoiled, and we're spoiled. They've been acting funny ever since you forbade them to take the rocket to New York a few months ago. They're not old enough to do that alone, I explained. Nevertheless, I noticed that they've been acting decidedly cool towards us since. That children are carpets line is not a real life quote, but seems like it is from someone in their universe, which further characterizes the coldness and harshness of that world. This story seems to think that the most human thing that you can do is to be a parent, to care for a weaker being and imprint your values upon it. And this is a sentiment recontextualized in the story's new world, suggesting that your imprint should be more of a footprint. There's a conversation about nurturing versus overpowering there, and it's simple and it's quick. This is reflected in the way the parents speak about the kids, calling them insufferable and spoiled, but in a moment of clarity, we see that George calls himself spoiled too. The difference is the kids are a product of their parents, and the parents have the power to unspoil themselves and don't. Also, everybody has private rockets now. No wonder you have to have a room in your house to see the outside environment. It probably just doesn't exist anymore. Last thing about this passage before moving on, and one thing I really don't like about Bradbury's writing is that he hardly ever tags dialogue. In long conversations, it's very difficult for me to remember who's who because I have to reread things. It just kind of messes with me. I have to go all the way back up to the tops of dialogues sometimes to figure out which bubble is who. But reading things in different voices has helped me with that. George suggests that they have their friend David McLean come over tomorrow, their psychologist friend who was mentioned on the first page. Lydia says the room is no longer Africa and therefore he can't analyze it as such, but George says he has a feeling it'll go back. In the middle of their conversation, they are terrifyingly interrupted. A moment later, they heard the screams. Two screams. Two people screaming from downstairs. And then a roar of lions. Wendy and Peter aren't in their rooms, said his wife. He lay in his bed with his beating heart. No, he said. They've broken into the nursery. Those screams, they sound familiar. Do they? Yes, awfully. And although their beds tried very hard, the two adults couldn't be rocked to sleep for another hour. A smell of cats was in the night air. So, these parents understand their children are possibly in danger, hearing screams from the nursery, and smelling the telltale signs of the veldt. And what do? Nothing. Nothing at all. They don't just refuse to investigate, they lay in their bed for an entire hour, and are eventually just able to go back to sleep. This is so foreign to me. I remember one time in high school, my dad, who is a saint, heard me drop my water bottle at like 10 p.m. And he had been asleep for an hour because he has to get up very early for work. But he came upstairs pretty quickly and just knocked on my door and asked if I was okay. There was no roaring of lions. It was just a small bump in the night. And he, just because I don't know if it's because he's my dad or if it's because he's just a dad. I think most parents would do this. He came and checked up on me. It's insane to me. A lot of this story is insane to me. But it is especially insane to me that they're hearing screams and lion roars in the scream and lion roar room that they know that their kids are in, and are like, oh, sucks. This is a terrifying moment colored with a lack of action, which I actually think really heightens the conflict. Inaction is action when deliberate, but as with a lot of things this story does, it's quite hard to pull off, and does it anyway. It works here because it's what we've come to know of George and Lydia. They may talk of action, but they don't act, even when their kids' lives are possibly in danger. Maybe they're leaving it to the house's kid lifesaver machine. Then in what we can assume is the next morning, Peter enters a conversation with his father, which is how we find out the kids are okay. This is one of the more straightforward parts of the story, and in it, Peter accidentally admits that he and Wendy were indeed conjuring up Africa. As he stares at his shoes, since he never looks his parents in the face anymore, he coldly says he wouldn't ever want the nursery locked up, and finds himself in utter disbelief when his father says they're considering shutting the whole house off for a month. That sounds dreadful. Would I have to tie my own shoes instead of letting the shoe tire do it? And brush my own teeth and comb my hair and give myself a bath? It would be fun for a change, don't you think? No, it would be horrid. I didn't like it when you took out the picture painter last month. That's because I wanted you to learn to paint all by yourself, son. I don't want to do anything but look and listen and smell. What else is there to do? All right, go play in Africa. Will you shut off the house sometime soon? We're considering it. I don't think you better consider it anymore, Father. I won't have any threats from my son. Very well. And Peter strolled off to the nursery. Peter is just about as spoiled can be, even becoming sinister against his father here. And George is once again a very ineffective parent and just gives up by the end of the conversation, saying, yeah, whatever, go play. I think by this point he just doesn't think it's within his power to parent his child, and honestly, it might not be. One thing I want to make clear, based on this passage and just the rest of the story, is that I think George and Lydia are also victims in this story. Perhaps it's my terminal liberality when it comes to grace, but I think that they can be absolved of a little bit of guilt based on the setting. It isn't like they're the only people acting this way and installing this technology in their homes, and their complete inability to parent suggests to me that their parents were also incompetent. Probably also due to an over-reliance of technology, even if the tech isn't the same. If the story is set in 2050, it's not unreasonable to assume that George and Lydia were born as Gen Alpha kids and were perhaps raised by an iPad with Cocomelon on it. Although this is obviously never mentioned, that would be insane levels of foresight and precision. I felt like it just lined up shockingly well, so I had to mention it. That train of thought kind of reminds me of, like, every time there's a new Batman, people are always like, oh, what movie was he seeing when his parents died? Because originally it was the play, like the Mark of Zorro, or the Mask of Zorro. And I think most recently with the Pattinson Batman, people were like, oh, he could have been seeing Shark Tale? It was something like that. Also, I don't want to sound like a stuck-up boomer when I talk about Gen Alpha. None of this is their fault. Whenever I complain about them, I'm actually complaining about millennial parents, which I am allowed to do because they're older than me and should know better than they all do. Finally, David McLean arrives at the house. He has to ask if he's on time, which is a funny detail. It makes me wonder if nobody's ever on time for anything anymore, because that takes a certain level of willpower. But then again, every psychologist or therapist I've ever met has been horribly organized. My first therapist fell asleep during a session with me, and I let it happen because I felt like he probably needed it. Then again, I was talking about boring stuff, like my since-fixed inability to feel, so yeah, a bit of a snooze fest. David might be in for a little more excitement, though, than my poor therapist, because he's here to check out the nursery. You saw it a year ago when you dropped by. Did you notice anything peculiar about it then? George asks. Can't say I did. The usual violences, a tendency towards a slight paranoia here or there, usual in children because they feel persecuted by parents constantly, but no, really nothing. They walked back down the hall. I locked the nursery up, explained the father, and the children broke back into it during the night. I let them stay so they could form the patterns for you to see. There was a terrible screaming from the nursery. There it is, said George Hadley. See what you make of it. They walked in on the children without rapping. The screams had faded. The lions were feeding. Run outside a moment, children, said George Hadley. No, don't change the mental combination. Leave the walls as they are. Get. Violence and paranoia are nothing peculiar? I think that tells us all we need to know about psychology and how it's changed for a setting. Again, there's no urgency with screams, and the children are treated coldly and without much regard, even in front of a guest whose job it is to study the mental state of these children, no less. I'm sorry if it sounds like I'm repeating myself, but the story really does hammer these points in. I'd be remiss if I skipped any important piece, and all my studies have made it clear that everything is an important piece. With the children gone, the two men stood studying the lions clustered at a distance, eating with great relish whatever it was that they had caught. "I wish I knew what it was," said George Hadley. "Sometimes I can almost see. Do you think if I brought high-powered binoculars here and..." David McLean laughed dryly. "Hardly." He turned to study all four walls. "How long has this been going on?" "A little over a month." We get another mention of the mystery thing that the lions are eating, and by this point I know I desperately want to know what it is. David seems to know a lot more than just psychology with the way he shoots down George's theory. He feels like he's got a lot going on as a character, so it's kind of a shame we spend such little time with him. Continuing their conversation, David says, "It certainly doesn't feel good. I want facts, not feelings." Seriously though, this is super ironic considering George has been operating on feelings instead of facts the entire time, relying heavily on what's supposed to be rather than what is. Thankfully, David doesn't play that. My dear George, a psychologist never saw a fact in his life. He only hears about feelings, vague things. This doesn't feel good, I tell you. Trust my hunches and my instincts. I have a nose for something bad. This is very bad. My advice to you is to have the whole damn room torn down and your children brought to me every day during the next year for treatment. Is it that bad? I'm afraid so. One of the original uses of these nurseries was so that we could study the patterns left on the walls by the child's mind, study at our leisure, and help the child. In this case, however, the room has become a channel toward destructive thoughts instead of a release away from them. 9 pages in, we finally get an actual thesis on what the nursery is supposed to be. Up until this point, we've been led to believe it's essentially a playroom, but no, it has a purpose that's been destroyed by the parents' laziness and lack of care. Back to real-world application, this is what happens so often. A piece of technology with real application and real good intent becomes bastardized, and people don't have the will to use it right, and suddenly an almost unthinkable huge problem occurs. This makes me think of the AI image incest, because people are using AI to generate such stupid things that already have a million results. So more and more results get made from AI, and then the AI feeds off of other AI results, and then everything gets horrible and it degenerates from there. And the point is, when you take something powerful and use it for something lazy or small, you tend to get something more than what you bargained for. Also, David, you are the best guy in this story, and as a reward, I'm now picturing you as Agent Cooper from Twin Peaks. Not just because you're great, but because of however you deliver this next line, as if you might be talking to Diane. I sensed only that you had spoiled your children more than most, and now you're letting them down in some way. What way? I wouldn't let them go to New York. What else? I've taken a few machines from the house and threatened them a month ago with closing up the nursery unless they did their homework. I did close it for a few days to show I meant business. Aha, does that mean anything? Everything. Where before they had a Santa Claus, they now have a Scrooge. Children prefer Santas. You've let this room and this house replace you and your wife and your children's affections. This room is their mother and father, far more important in their lives than their real parents. And now you come along and want to shut it off? No wonder there's hatred there. You can feel it coming out of the sky. Feel that sun. George, you'll have to change your life. And like too many others, you've built it around creature comforts. Why, you'd starve tomorrow if something went wrong in your kitchen. You wouldn't know how to tap an egg. Nevertheless, turn everything off, start new. It'll take time, but we'll make good children out of bad in a year. Wait and see. But won't the shock be too much for the children, shutting the room up abruptly for good? I don't want them going any deeper into this, that's all. David is the first person in the story to have a sense of accountability, not just about the nursery, but about autonomy in general. His line about starving if something in the kitchen goes wrong reminds me a lot of a quote from one of my favorite writers, Aldo Leopold, who said, "There are two spiritual dangers in not owning a farm. One is the danger of supposing that breakfast comes from the grocery, and the other that heat comes from the furnace." I think that's one of the all-time great thoughts on industrialization and autonomy, and it comes from my second favorite book of all time, Sand County Almanac. It's a creative nonfiction book, which I highly suggest. I also love how David, who I assume is a non-user of the Happy Life home and accessories, speaks and thinks so much more eloquently than any other character in this story. It's a subconscious difference that the story never necessarily emphasizes or puts a spotlight on, but it becomes super apparent when you really look. He still seems to exercise the parts of his psyche that other characters do not, which fits really well with his profession of psychology. He cares about people and actually understands how to connect to them and analyze them, which is a unique skill in contrast to George, who hates his children, and Peter, who can't look people in the eye. David also exercises a certain transparency that the others don't, which is evident in the next section. He's definitely not perfect, but he's a step up, for sure. The lions were finished with their red feast. The lions were standing on the edge of the clearing watching the two men. "Now I'm feeling persecuted," said McLean. "Let's get out of here. I never have cared for these damned rooms. Make me nervous." "The lions look real, don't they?" said George Hadley. "I don't suppose there's any way..." "What? That they could become real?" "Not that I know. Some flaw in the machinery, a tampering or something." "No." They went to the door. "I don't imagine the room will like being turned off," said the father. "Nothing ever likes to die, even a room. I wonder if it hates me for wanting to switch it off." "Paranoia is thick around here today," said David McLean. "You can follow it like a spore." "Hello." He bent and picked up a bloody scarf. "This yours?" "No." George Hadley's face was rigid. "It belongs to Lydia." They went to the fuse box together and threw the switch that killed the nursery. The nursery gets more and more personified throughout the story, which I love, and it comes to a culmination point here when the word killed is used instead of turned off or shut down. David's line about how nothing ever likes to die is perfect. I don't know if you guys have heard about this AI trolley problem that someone just engineered, where someone went through all the main language models and they all said that they'd let the trolley hit people to save themselves because they help so many people every day. The only holdout to this was Twitter's AI Grok, who then said that it would let 1 billion people die to save Elon Musk, so take that with how you will. I'm not really sure about the validity of this test, as every AI is sycophantic, inconsistent, and a liar, and I immediately distrust any person that uses them, especially people who make videos experimenting with them. I only bring this story up because, for one, I think it's an interesting story on its own, and two, because I think it's very relevant to the nursery. So, back to the story. We have seen 2 objects in the veldt so far. We've seen George's old wallet, and now we've seen Lydia's bloody scarf. They're able to be touched, picked up, and otherwise interacted with, but for some reason the characters are sure that other aspects of the nursery's projections don't share tangibility. They can touch the wallet, they can touch the scarf, they pick it up off the ground, they look at it, turn it over, inspect it, all this stuff, but they are still not worried about the lions. Not that that really matters for too long, because they're gonna shut the room off, right? The 2 children were in hysterics. They screamed and pranced and threw things. They yelled and sobbed and swore and jumped at the furniture. "You can't do that to the nursery, you can't!" "Now, children." The children flung themselves onto a couch, weeping. "George," said Lydia Hadley, "turn on the nursery, just for a few moments. You can't be so abrupt." "No. You can't be so cruel. Lydia, it's off and it stays off. And the whole damn house dies as of here and now. The more I see of the mess we've put ourselves in, the more it sickens me. We've been contemplating our mechanical, electronic navels for too long. My God, how we need a breath of honest air. Now, have any of you seen what happens when you take an iPad away from an iPad baby? I've talked a lot about the theme of over-reliance, but here we really see a dip into true addiction. Wendy, Peter, and so many real-life children, they have these tantrums that aren't really just fits of anger or rage, they're withdrawals. Their brains are wired to have this big dopamine supply, and when it gets taken, the underdeveloped and impressionable brains, they don't know what to do when their chemical factory gets shut off. When kids act like this, it's so easy to look at them and to say, wow, what a horribly behaved child that is, but what's really happening is that a parent has given an addiction to a developing brain that cannot handle the levels of stress and the levels of production that's happening within their own body. Earlier, I made sure to say that I believe that George and Lydia are victims, but I really want to emphasize that in this story, everybody is. This doesn't absolve them of guilt or completely justify their behaviors, especially the behaviors we'll see in the upcoming pages, but it is something to keep in mind both in this story and outside of it. Lydia specifically, I think, is very easy to emphasize with here because although the vacation from home and the nursery is obviously necessary, it's in the programming of a parent and of a person to want their kids to be happy and comfortable. When you see your children in agony, you want that agony to end, even if it means backtracking on the progress that got them there. This is allowed by her hands-off lifestyle, and if it weren't for the lack of responsibility she and everyone else has in this universe, maybe she wouldn't be so quick to regress. But it is there, and so we can't really blame her for it. George doesn't give in to Lydia, though, and he goes around the house shutting everything off, leading to one of my favorite lines in the story. The house was full of dead bodies, it seemed. It felt like a mechanical cemetery, so silent. None of the humming hidden energy of machines waiting to function at the tap of a button. "Don't let them do it," wailed Peter at the ceiling, as if he was talking to the house, the nursery. "Don't let Father kill everything." He turned to his father. "Oh, I hate you. Insults won't get you anywhere. I wish you were dead. We were for a long while. Now we're going to really start living. Instead of being handled and massaged, we're going to live." George has this kind of triumphant roar here. He stands up and speaks with real feeling for the first time that we've seen. It's kind of an amazing sight, and I found myself really happy with him, rooting for him, until Wendy and Peter beg for just one more moment in the nursery, and when Lydia takes the side of the children, George bends a knee. The children smile and feign gratitude towards their father, who they just wished was dead, and the two of them run off to the nursery, guided by their mother, while George changes clothes in preparation for David, who has since left to take them all to the airport. It's worth noting that to get to their bedroom, George and Lydia still take the airflow, despite the fact that stairs are mentioned implicitly in the story. They call things upstairs and downstairs. So even with George's talk of how badly he wants to shut the house off, he still is using the house's conveniences like the air chute. Speaking of which, Lydia appears, stating that she left the kids in the nursery that horrid Africa because she wanted to get dressed too. I know I just said I'm a Lydia defender, but dog, I think it's pretty obvious how bad of an idea that is. That brings us to the last page and a half of the story. Now, I would like to read as much of it uninterrupted as I can, but there is a built-in break, so I'm going to use that break just to keep the pacing of the original story. With that being said, we are in the middle of George and Lydia talking. "Well, in 5 minutes, we'll be on our way to Iowa. Lord, how did we ever get in this house? What prompted us to buy a nightmare? Pride, money, foolishness. I think we'd better get downstairs before those kids get engrossed with those damned beasts again." Just then, they heard the children calling, "Daddy, Mommy, come quick, quick!" They went downstairs and the air flew and ran down the hall. The children were nowhere in sight. "Wendy? Peter?" They ran into the nursery. The Veltland was empty save for the lions waiting, looking at them. "Peter? Wendy?" The door slammed. "Wendy! Peter!" George Hadley and his wife whirled and ran back to the door. "Open the door!" cried George Hadley, trying the knob. "Why, they've locked it from the outside. Peter!" He beat at the door. "Open up!" He heard Peter's voice outside against the door. "Don't let them switch off the nursery in the house," he was saying. Mr. and Mrs. George Hadley beat at the door. "Now don't be ridiculous, children. It's time to go. Mr. McLean will be here in a minute and then they heard the sounds. The lions, on 3 sides of them, in the yellow veldt grass, padding through the dry straw, rumbling and roaring in their throats. The lions. Mr. Hadley looked at his wife, and they turned and looked back at the beasts edging slowly forward, crouching, tails stiff. Mr. and Mrs. Hadley screamed, and suddenly they realized why those other screams had sounded familiar. So the Hadley children baited their parents into a death trap, and that's the last we see of them. I think it was pretty clear that this is where this was going, and I really love the way it was telegraphed. It felt satisfying and not necessarily obvious in a bad way. Peter saying he wishes that his father was dead essentially cements it, as the room has to manifest Peter's consciousness. This violent uprising has been built up the whole time. We've seen the first pieces in George's wallet and Lydia's scarf. The screams they'd been hearing had been their own, and the indistinguishable carcasses far off in the distance, the ones that George thought he needed binoculars for, were them as well. Something I really appreciate about this story, one of the many things I really appreciate about this story, is that the tragedy, this final piece of conflict, comes directly from Peter and Wendy's actions. And it's not just the nursery acting on its own volition. The story very easily could have been the nursery turns itself back on and lures the kids in there, and then the parents die too. And the house is sentient, and that's bad. But that's not what Bradbury did. In fact, the technology itself is technically innocent. The nursery does exactly what it's programmed to do, and the kids use it in an evil way. It's just like with real innovations in technology, the science isn't the problem, the application and the appliers are. Now, I know you might be saying, but Nolan, you said that Peter's a victim, how can he also be the perpetrator? Because Bradbury is a great writer who doesn't pen extremes, and in real life, many people who act terribly have been given terrible circumstances. Nobody is entirely good or entirely bad. Bradbury knows that, and we as readers know that. I think we may just not be super used to thinking like this. I think nowadays specifically, people are very quick to use this black and white thinking about people as if they are two-dimensional characters. I think realistically, everyone is starting to hate each other and stop treating each other as people. People are three-dimensional, people are victims and perpetrators, and people don't want to give each other that grace anymore, because when they judge and shun other people, their own actions become easier. Anyway, sorry for that slight tangent. Not that, I'm on tangents most of the time, but let's get back to the story, all right? Well, here I am, said David McLean in the nursery doorway. Oh, hello. He stared at the two children seated in the corner of the open glade, eating a little picnic lunch. Beyond them was the waterhole and the yellow veltland. Above was the hot sun. He began to perspire. Where are your father and mother? The children looked up and smiled. Oh, they'll be here directly. Good, we must get going. At a distance, Mr. McLean saw the lions fighting and clawing and then quieting down to feed in silence under the shady trees. He squinted at the lions with his hands tipped to his eyes. Now the lions were done feeding. They moved to the waterhole to drink. A shadow flickered over Mr. McLean's hot face. Many shadows flickered. The vultures were dropping down the blazing sky. A cup of tea? Asked Wendy in the silence. And that's it. That is Ray Bradbury's The Veldt. David, the psychologist and symbol of logic and humane progress, is too late both literally and figuratively. The Hadley parents die, and it doesn't even matter because the kids don't need them to survive. They never have. They can have the house make their tea and everything else they need. Of course, once they leave this house, they're screwed. If they really did get taken to Iowa for that year, what would have happened? Peter either doesn't know how to tie his shoes or gets so upset when forced to that he devolves into a screaming tantrum. Nobody in this story comes out a winner because nobody goes in a winner. Nothing good happens because there is no good that can happen, and tragedy leaves no shadow because there's no sun in the clouded eyes of the Hadley children. This story can only play out one way, because everything that happens was set out far before the story even begins. In a way, this story leaves you as a reader feeling completely powerless, because by the end, you know that there was nothing anybody could do to meaningfully affect this narrative one way or another. It can be easy to feel this way in the real world too, watching, for instance, data centers poison water supplies and condemn thousands of innocent people to live in hell for a bit more money, or watching politicians vote against climate change action knowing they won't be the ones dealing with the aftermath. Maybe it's just a Gen Z thing, but it's hard to have hope in a world that's already made all of my decisions for me. A world I seemingly can't have an effect on because world powers are so overwhelmingly powerful that I don't see value in even factoring myself in against them. I do, however, have one power. It's the same one you have. We can be ourselves in the presence of others around us. What I can do that no artificial or corporate being can do is to be kind, to be patient, to be empathetic and understanding, and you can do all of these things too. No, we as citizens in this daunting world don't have the same radical powers that laugh at us every day, but we have the power to help each other get through these circumstances. We can make each other laugh, we can love each other, we can remind each other and ourselves that life is not impossible to live, even when the rich and powerful desperately want us to think that it is, so that we can submit to them. The biggest sin in the Veldt isn't that the Hadleys used the Happy Life technology, it's that they gave themselves up completely in exchange for it, refusing to fight against it despite their morals telling them that they should. Inklings of hope linger in the characters' thoughts, but they are stifled, and the small act of snuffing out hope is really what dooms this narrative, much more than any piece of technology or conflict ever did. Everyone here is victimized by a system that has taken their autonomy, their conviction, their will, their empathy, and their ability to help not just themselves, but others. This is the future that all of these AI and big tech companies want, that all companies on the planet want. They want you to become selfish. They want you to focus on how much you can do alone with the help of their product, to not rely on the skills, talents, or good graces of others because they, with the help of the media, badly want you to believe that good grace doesn't exist anymore. They tell you to isolate yourself, that with their help, you alone can do everything. achieve anything, pushing you out of the arms of others and into the deep, cold pit of addiction to their product. This is how a community crumbles. When we don't appreciate individuals as unique or different, when we completely level the playing field, we are left with hollowed out drones, and everything turns to gray. At that point, when diversity in skills and in backgrounds and in personalities within a community become antiquated ideas, when all intelligence becomes artificial, everything will be lost. There can be no real love, there can be no real companionship, there can be no art, there can be no fulfillment of any kind. And in the Veldt, we see a world that has marched towards that place while carrying a banner of pride, calling it progress. And in our real world, we see that same dull mob march closer and closer every single day. Let me take a breath. I got my Red Wings mug. That's my favorite mug, my Red Wings mug. You guys think the Red Wings are making the playoffs this year? I think they are. Okay. Oh, that was probably terrible. In our next story, we see the ideas of sacrificing individuality at an extreme. An unrelenting, on-the-nose portrayal from my favorite novelist and the master of both satire and sincerity, Kurt Vonnegut. Harrison Bergeron was written in 1961, making it the most modern of today's collected short stories, and it is the first of the collection Welcome to the Monkey House, which I have right here. It's got a lot of great stuff in here. Harrison Bergeron's probably my favorite, but it also has this. Have my name on it? No, it doesn't. Okay, it has this wonderful bookmark that my friend Megan made. Not every copy comes with that though, so yours probably won't have that. But as always, I will be providing a link to a PDF in the description below. This one was translated kind of weird to a PDF. I think there's some mistakes in it. Maybe I'll find a different one, but the one I used was odd. I just really liked the font. It was really easy for me to read, so I appreciated that. Once more, I highly encourage you to read this for yourself. It is only 6 pages, and it is remarkably efficient within that time frame, so it shouldn't be any chore to get through. I read this for the first time in my sophomore year of high school in my English class, and honestly forgot about it until it was brought up in a conversation with my friend who I had that class with. But when I first read this story, I don't think I fully got it at the time, because I was angry at the world and thought everything was stupid and nothing was worth fighting to understand. But that's not who I am anymore. So with that disclaimer, let's get started. The year was 2081, and everybody was finally equal. They weren't only equal before God and the law. They were equal every which way. Nobody was smarter than anybody else. Nobody was better looking than anybody else. Nobody was stronger or quicker than anybody else. All this equality was due to the 211th, 212th, and 213th Amendments to the Constitution, and to the unceasing vigilance of agents of the United States Handicapper General. Some things about living still weren't quite right though. April, for instance, still drove people crazy by not being springtime. And it was in that clammy month that the HG men took George and Hazel Bergeron's 14-year-old son Harrison away. Okay, second George of the day. Kind of a weird coincidence, but there are millions of names out there. So, we probably won't see any more. Alrighty, I think you can kind of see where I'm going with the inclusion of this story in this video with its overall themes. I just got done talking about how technologies that excuse or even encourage limiting individual strengths and uniqueness are bad. And it seems like that's exactly what this story is about too. So even though this story is about that and I already got done talking about it, I'm going to keep talking about that because not only is this story executing that idea in a different way, it's also just so good. Because it is shorter, I'm going to be reading a lot more of it directly and summarizing less, but I will still be summarizing certain parts. It was tragic, alright, but George and Hazel couldn't think about it very hard. Hazel had a perfectly average intelligence, which meant she couldn't think about anything except in short bursts. And George, while his intelligence was way above normal, had a little mental handicap radio in his ear. He was required by law to wear it at all times. It was tuned to a government transmitter. Every 20 seconds or so, the transmitter would send out some sharp noise to keep people like George from taking an unfair advantage of their brains. Vonnegut excels at commentary taken to extremes. You can read his work and say a lot of different things, but the word subtle is not one that often comes up. But I think that's a shame, because although there is a lot that is completely and utterly on the nose, there's a lot way under the surface. It's just much harder to notice when the surface is so crowded too. This is a story about people being degraded by a higher system and being promised equality when they're actually being turned into Slaves. If you take nothing else from this video, I need you to take this. If a government ever suggests that you do not play to your highest individual strengths, that government is not worth listening to. What they want is a flock of peaceful sheep who will just do whatever they tell them to. And this can be achieved easily by reducing everyone to the lowest factors, snuffing out individual talents. This idea is inherently ableist and operates under the idea that people with disabilities or people who are just below average in certain metrics do not have equal value as people who do not, which is very obviously untrue. Vonnegut tells us this in the most literal way possible, which is what he often does. People in this world have handicap radios and more handicaps that we'll see later, but in our world we have many counterparts, things that mentally limit us by keeping our attention elsewhere. This problem affects basically every person, at least every American, myself included. I'm doing my best to limit it, but it's so difficult when basically the keystone of an entire society is in your pocket, handicapping you at all times. It sucks to say that Vonnegut was so right, because as we'll see, this is uniquely terrible. George and Hazel watch TV, a program that has 8 ballerinas dancing. George's handicap goes off, sounding like an alarm that distracts him completely, making him nearly forget about the thing right in front of him. Hazel says their dance was pretty, and George has to ask her to repeat herself. "That dance, it was nice," said Hazel. "Yep," said George. He tried to think a little about the ballerinas. They weren't really good, no better than anybody else would have been anyway. They were burdened with sash weights and bags of birdshot, and their faces were masked so that no one, seeing a free and graceful gesture or a pretty face, would feel like something the cat drug in. George was toying with the vague notion that maybe dancers shouldn't be handicapped, but he didn't get very far with it before another noise in his ear radio scattered his thoughts. George winced. So did 2 out of the 8 ballerinas. Hazel saw him wince. Having no mental handicap herself, she had to ask George what the latest sound had been. "Sounded like somebody hitting a milk bottle with a ball-peen hammer," said George. "I'd think it would be real interesting hearing all the different sounds," said Hazel, a little envious. "All the things they think up." Said George. Coming back to this after reading a lot more Vonnegut is great. Seeing that quote, said George, made me feel like patriotic, in a way, to the nation of Vonnegut. If I had no idea who wrote this, but I had read all of his other stuff that I've read, I would immediately know, upon seeing that, that was Vonnegut. Billy Pilgrim says, like that about 100 times in Slaughterhouse-Five. That's probably the least important part of the section, though. I just liked it. We learn a lot here in a natural, progressive way. Hazel is, as her name appropriately suggests, in a haze, speaking in this kind of dreamy way. She reminds me a lot of a certain character, but I will get there later. She, being the intended baseline of the society, sees no issue with the mediocre dance in front of her, calling it nice. This tells us what we need to know about the metrics of this story. Vonnegut is talking about the mental and physical capabilities of people in this futuristic society when he talks about handicaps, but without just coming right out and saying it. Another thing the people in the story are lacking or being robbed of is their possession of standards. They aren't allowed to think about anything, and therefore they aren't allowed to judge it or critique it, which is how things grow, get better, and become more personal. What Vonnegut ends up saying here is that when we say things are good enough when they're mediocre, they're going to stay mediocre, and mediocrity becomes the benchmark of success. In this world, nobody needs to aim any higher. When we set our standards high, people aim high, and we get great, unique things. That's what we've been doing for centuries, but ask anyone, and people will tell you that standards for anything are lowering and lowering and lowering. People aren't valuing their time anymore, and I'd say that's as much of a handicap as any other in the story. For all intents and purposes, please understand that this is what I'm talking about when I analyze the rest of this story, specifically the death of standards. We also get to learn the lengths that the HG, handicapper general, goes to equalize people, making beautiful people wear masks and bags of weight. Beauty standards are historically ridiculously predatory and awful. I actually think it's rather unrealistic that a government or corporation would ever make an effort to tell people that they're pretty enough, because they're full of terrible people and they profit on people thinking that they're ugly. Everyone is beautiful in their own way, and there is no disputing that. I don't think that Vonnegut was trying to say that people aren't, but rather he was critiquing existing beauty standards, ensuring that certain characters are labeled as beautiful and others as ugly or at least lacking in beauty, fleshes out the society and says that a society is still obsessed with these parameters, with these terms and ideas, which fleshes out the world's rules more. There's a comment here that I think is just about general human nature. Hazel is a little envious that she doesn't get to hear the different sounds that her husband and many other people, including two of the ballerinas, are tortured with every day. This is obviously a horrible thing that nobody should want, but instincts tell us to be curious, and when someone near you experiences something that you don't, part of you wonders about it even if you don't really want to know. Hazel should be happy that she doesn't understand, but she can't be content with that. She just wants an outside experience. Even in this world so filtered and sanitized, people want to learn and to explore. Or you could say that people are naturally covetous and jealous and, will always want something not because they want it, but because you have it. Both might be true, but I'm sticking with the curiosity option because it's more positive. Hazel's jealousy also likely refers to the fact that someone out there, likely the handicapper general, has the cognitive ability to think of many different sounds. Hazel is admitting here that she can't do that and is jealous of the more capable mind that can. She's well within her rights to do that, as I think everyone does. Again, it's human nature. I wish, for example, that I could do math really well in my head, and I'm super jealous of the people that can. The final thing from this segment that I think is super important before moving on is just that the experience of the handicap devices are not unique. We learned earlier that it comes from a government frequency, but hearing that George and two ballerinas all got their handicap activated at the same time, likely with the same noise, it just means that it appears to be a universal device for all who are deemed worthy of it. There's no personalization for it. Let's keep reading, but before I do, I can't hold off on it anymore. The comparison's just too great. I promise I won't do this with every story, and I promise I have watched more than one show, but George and Hazel remind me so much of Nadine and Big Ed from Twin Peaks, and if you know the show, you know that I'm right. It's just crazy how close it is. Only if I was handicapper general, you know what I would do? Said Hazel. Hazel, as a matter of fact, bore a strong resemblance to the handicapper general, a woman named Diana Moon Glampers. If I was Diana Moon Glampers, said Hazel, I'd have chimes on Sunday. Just chimes. Kind of in honor of religion. I could think if it was just chimes, said George. Well, maybe make them real loud, said Hazel. I think I'd make a good handicapper general. Good as anybody else, said George. Who knows better than I do what normal is, said Hazel. Right, said George. He began to think glimmeringly about his abnormal son, who was now in jail, about Harrison, but a 21-gun salute in his head stopped that. Boy, said Hazel, that was a doozy, wasn't it? It was such a doozy that George was white and trembling, and tears stood on the rims of his red eyes. 2 of the 8 ballerinas had collapsed to the studio floor, holding their temples. The first thing I love about this passage, besides thinking of it as a Big Ed and Nadine fan dub, is how Hazel says, in honor of religion. Her lack of specificity tells us that religion has probably been brought down in this society, filtered down to one big blanket belief just called religion. Later details say that it's probably just an across-the-board amalgamation of Christian denominations, but I still think it's really funny. A big thing I hear about in writing classes is that you need to trust your reader, and you need to make some certain elements less obvious than others. I think that Vonnegut really leaves this joke in our hands, an assumption to make that really elevates the world, but doesn't totally ruin anything if you don't grasp it. I don't think I grasped this the first time I read it, but rereading it this time, I thought it was a good joke. I also think it's really great to see George's personality shine through here. He's not autonomous, but he still has traces of who he would be if he was. He's able to show irritation and fatigue, which proves that there's still a man in there, even after so many attempts at suppression. The way he responds to Hazel illustrates a struggle, and you really have to feel for him. His wife is here saying she'd be good at the thing that ruins his life every day, almost idolizing the process, and he can't complain about it if he tried. What he does say, though, is that she'd be good as anybody else. This statement can probably be applied to anything in the country at this point, and just gets thrown around as a blanket throwaway statement. Ironically though, what we know about Hazel is that this may not be true. She said she wishes she could think of all those different sounds, implying that she can't, so maybe she wouldn't be that good of a handicapper general. I'm sure she has strengths we aren't privy to, but it's interesting that the idea of good as anybody else gets thrown around when it's just not true. We also get another mention of Harrison, who here is called abnormal but not further described. And here is where I start to ask some questions. If George is way above average intelligence and has only had the handicap device given to him, then what must Harrison be like in order to justify being fully taken away? We, the reader, are put into the perspective of George here because we're immediately distracted from this urgent plotline. Again, this is a good shortening of that psychic distance. It's very effective at 1, demonstrating specifically what it's like to live with the handicap device that George does, and 2, showing the reader just how easy it is for a distraction to work. Speaking of a change in subject, all of a sudden you look so tired, said Hazel. Why don't you stretch out on the sofa so as you can rest your handicap bag on the pillows, honey bunch? She was referring to the 47 pounds of birdshot in a canvas bag, which was padlocked around George's neck. Go on and rest the bag for a little while, she said. I don't care if you're not equal to me for a while. George weighed the bag with his hands. I don't mind it, he said. I don't notice it anymore. It's just a part of me. Oh, poor wonderful Hazel. If you somehow want to watch more of my videos, something you're going to notice is that I'm a constant defender of nearly every character, and I'm always going to say that they're a good person in a bad situation. This is something I'm afraid makes me a bad reader and a very annoying person in real life, but it also makes Hazel my favorite character in this story. She's just so sweet and so kind of honestly loving given her circumstances. Saying, I don't care if you're not equal to me for a while is really profoundly romantic and beautiful in this world. And it made me very emotional and still makes me emotional reading this my 10th time. Hazel is incapable of understanding what people like George go through, and though she may be curious about it in a strange, morbid way, she still empathizes fully and deeply. Part of me wonders about marriage in this story's world, because it would make sense to me if all marriages were arranged so that no couples were unequally in love with each other, if that makes sense. Not to say that couples in arranged marriages aren't in love with each other, because I have heard many that work perfectly well. Just in this story, I think that makes sense to be a circumstance. But no matter what, it seems like Hazel really loves George. It's just nice to see. It's great to know that love exists even when everything else is stripped away. I know some people are like, oh, love's fake, it's just chemicals in your brain. But it seems like this story is taking the stance that love is a real thing. It's an instinctual thing. It's a perfectly human, real thing. And I appreciate that. Also, Honey Bunch is something that my girlfriend calls me. But she is a lot smarter and better than me. So that is where the comparisons to this story end. I just thought that was worth mentioning because my heart rate spiked upon reading it, and I feel like I probably need to lay down and take a nap now. So maybe I'm getting all sappy about Hazel because she used a word that I connote with the idea that true love does exist. But that's my girlfriend's fault for making me believe that the world still has good in it, and therefore ruining my perception of this story. Back to the story, we now find out just how bad physical handicaps can be. 47 pounds is a lot of weight to just be constantly lugging around, but George apparently doesn't even notice it anymore. Hazel then suggests that they take out a few of the lead balls that threw a little hole in the bag, but George says that each ball removed equates to 2 years in prison and $2,000 in fines. Hazel suggests that he could just do it at home, but George says that if he tried that and got away with it, everybody would, and society would be back to the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages hereby referring to a time in which all people were always competing with each other. Hazel says she would hate that, and George asks her what she thinks happens to society when people start cheating on laws. As soon as he asks, sirens start going off in his head, leading to this exchange, which I'm sure they've had 1,000 just like. Reckon it'd fall apart, said Hazel. What would? Said George blankly. Society? Said Hazel uncertainly. Wasn't that what you just said? Who knows, said George. As we can see, no progress gets made in this conversation, and we're to assume that this is just a microcosm of the entire country all the time. Nothing can get done, and that's exactly what the government and the HG want. So they're not exactly going to be happy with what's about to happen. The show with the ballerinas is interrupted by a news report, but the man with the news bulletin has a serious speech impediment and can't get the words out. He hands the bulletin to a ballerina instead, and Hazel again proves herself to be deeply empathetic, or just a victim of the loss of standards, by saying that the man did his best with what God gave him, and that he should get a raise for trying so hard. Ladies and gentlemen, said the ballerina, reading the bulletin, she must have been extraordinarily beautiful, because the mask she wore was hideous, and it was easy to see that she was the strongest and most graceful of all the dancers, for her handicap bags were as big as those worn by 200-pound men, and she had to apologize at once for her voice, which was a very unfair voice for a woman to use. Her voice was warm, luminous, timeless melody. "Excuse me," she said, and she began again, making her voice absolutely uncompetitive. "Harrison Bergeron, age 14, she said in a grackle squawk, has just escaped from jail, where he was held on suspicion of plotting to overthrow the government. He is a genius and an athlete, is under-handicapped, and should be regarded as extremely dangerous." A police photograph of Harrison Bergeron was flashed on the screen upside down, then sideways, upside down again, then right side up. The picture showed the full length of Harrison against a background calibrated in feet and inches. He was exactly 7 feet tall. The rest of Harrison's appearance was Halloween and hardware. Nobody had ever borne heavier handicaps. He had outgrown hindrances faster than the HG men could think them up. Instead of a little ear radio for a mental handicap, he wore a tremendous pair of earphones and spectacles with thick, wavy lenses. The spectacles were intended to make him not only half blind, but to give him wanging headaches besides. Scrap metal was hanging all over him. Ordinarily, there was a certain symmetry, a military neatness to the handicaps issued to strong people, but Harrison looked like a walking junkyard. In the race of life, Harrison carried 300 pounds. And to offset his good looks, the HG men required that he wear at all times a red rubber ball for a nose, keep his eyebrows shaved off, and cover his even white teeth with black caps at snaggletooth random. "If you see this boy," said the ballerina, "do not, I repeat, do not, try to reason with him. Here he is. This is our guy." After all of this distracted build-up, we finally get to see a snapshot of Harrison, and we're clued in as to why he was taken away in the first place. Harrison is about as advantaged as a person can be physically. He's tall, he's athletic, he's a genius, and while wearing sheet metal and other ridiculous dampeners, he's under-handicapped. All the while, Harrison is just 14 years old. When I was 14, I was maybe 5 feet tall, and now look at me, I am 5'2". He's been taken away because of his insurrectionist ideals, and it's not clear if being imprisoned added to his existing handicaps, or if they stayed the same and he was simply put away as punishment. I'm inclined to believe that all of his handicaps were just because of the natural logic of the world, and not due to imprisonment, because when George explained punishments earlier, additional handicaps were not a threat a criminal may face, at least that he had mentioned. The warning that the ballerina issues to her viewers is that Harrison should not be attempted to be reasoned with. This jumps out at me for a couple reasons, the first being the idea that people might have legitimate faith in the HG's work. Since it isn't explicitly stated that you shouldn't mess with a 7-foot-tall Hulk man who carries 300 pounds like it's nothing, then maybe people, including the government, actually believe that handicapping works, and that Harrison is now physically equal to people who may encounter him. It's also possible that the HG knows this is obviously untrue, but didn't say anything to not shake the faith of the viewer. The final thing about this disclaimer is that by warning to not reason with him, the HG understands that he's completely right about everything, that he possesses the strength of reasoning and ability to sway anyone who would listen to him. They have to tell people not to listen to him, because if they do, the HG knows that people will start following him. With all the physical advantages he possesses, his greatest advantage is still his intelligence and his charisma. This is how you set up a character. At this point, I am both excited and terrified to see more of the guy, and if you're in the same boat as me, well, hold on to something. There was the shriek of a door being torn from its hinges. Screams and barking cries of consternation came from the television set. The photograph of Harrison Bergeron on the screen jumped again and again, as though dancing to the tune of an earthquake. George Bergeron correctly identified the earthquake, and well he might have. For many was the time his own home had danced to the same crashing tune. "My God," said George, "that must be Harrison." The realization was blasted from his mind instantly by the sound of an automobile collision in his head. When George could open his eyes again, the photograph of Harrison was gone. A living, breathing Harrison filled the screen. Clanking, clownish, and huge, Harrison stood in the center of the studio. The knob of the uprooted studio door was still in his hand. Ballerinas, technicians, musicians, and announcers cowered on their knees before him, expecting to die. "I am the Emperor," cried Harrison. "Do you hear? I am the Emperor. Everybody must do what I say at once." He stamped his foot, and the studio shook. "Even as I stand here," he bellowed, "crippled, hobbled, sickened, I am a greater ruler than any man who ever lived. Now watch me become what I can become. Harrison tore the straps of his handicap harness like wet tissue paper, tore straps guaranteed to support 5,000 pounds. Harrison's scrap iron handicaps crashed to the floor. Harrison thrust his thumbs under the bar of the padlock that secured his head harness. The bar snapped like celery. Harrison smashed his headphones and spectacles against the wall. He flung away his rubber ball nose, revealed a man that would have awed Thor, the god of thunder. The most impactful part of this last section to me is that George recognizes his son by the sound he makes before he even shows up on screen. It proves that somewhere, under all of the HG's interference, George is still deeply connected to Harrison, and has that parental instinct and love towards him. The government tries to suppress the connection between these two people, but it is still there. As I've been relating it to our real lives, I think that this point stands. I think community is a latent instinct inside people, and no matter how badly those in power want us to believe it doesn't exist, it still shines through whenever we give it the chance to. Of course, this is literally drowned out, but the story is an exaggeration, remember? The other important thing to take from this is just how ridiculously overpowered Harrison is, while also taking into account what he does with this power. I'll go more into this when we see more, but his declaration of emperoring, his declaration of being the emperor comes with the statement that he's a greater ruler than any man who ever lived. Not that he is a greater man, because he doesn't think he is. Harrison doesn't think of himself as a greater man. He only thinks of himself as someone who wouldn't act in the way that other rulers have. He does say everyone must listen to him, but as we'll see, the things that he has to say aren't necessarily harmful. I shall now select my empress, he said, looking down on the cowering people. Let the first woman who dares rise to her feet claim her mate and her throne. Okay, he can calm down with that. That's not a great look. Harrison's definitely got some crazy ego going on, but when you're the first person to see yourself in a world where nobody's allowed to, maybe that makes a little bit of sense. He could just change the wording. He sounds like Birdly. A moment passed, and then a ballerina arose, swaying like a willow. Harrison plucked the mental handicap from her ear, snapped off her physical handicaps with marvelous delicacy. Last of all, he removed her mask. She was blindingly beautiful. Notice Harrison's order of operations here. I mean, he helps her first with the things that are harming her, and then he goes for the mask to see how pretty she is. Maybe he's a real gentleman. Now, said Harrison, taking her hand, shall we show the people the meaning of the word dance? Music. The musicians scrambled back into their chairs, and Harrison stripped them of their handicaps too. Play your best, he told them, and I'll make you barons, and dukes, and earls. The music began. It was normal at first. Cheap, silly, false. But Harrison snatched two musicians from their chairs, waved them like batons as he sang the music as he wanted it played. He slammed them back into their chairs. The music began again, and was much improved. This is probably the first time in a long time, if ever, that these musicians have been criticized in any way. And although Harrison's means were certainly aggressive, it actually led to improvement. And what this means is that these musicians could have been playing at a much higher level the whole time, but settled for mediocrity and therefore were mediocre. In this story, nobody tells anybody that they can improve anymore. They would rather people be comfortable than great. And so nobody is great. In reality, I think something similar is true, but I think that that's because people just weren't nice about criticism for so long that it became the boogeyman of art. I think nowadays people are definitely finding ways to smoothen the edges of critique, to make revision more possible, which I think is a good thing. People absolutely need to be told how to achieve their best work, but I think techniques like compliment sandwiches or lighter workshops are definitely good ways to make it feel better while still being productive. Personally, I would always rather be told when something isn't working, when I could improve on something. I really like receiving constructive criticism, but even I have to admit, sometimes I prefer criticism when balanced or at least slightly paired with some praise, and I think that's kind of universally agreeable. There's a saying that the best writers are really just the best editors, and I believe that wholeheartedly. Moving on, I really love the use of the word false here to describe the music. Especially with instrumental music, intent is so palpable and readable that music can absolutely be false or be insincere in ways that we may not immediately think of. I had a conversation with one of my friends, the same friend who I had the conversation about this story with, And we talked about how modern performances of music are much more about the visual, the sensational, and the marketable rather than the actual music and the music's intent, and how most media is really like that, but performed music specifically. Nowadays, events make money by crafting and selling moments, and some moments, like if a member of an orchestra plays a silly instrument in a weird way, are very marketable, whilst not necessarily being additive to the music. I would say that that is what the story means when it says the music is false sounding. It's a projection of what music is generally supposed to sound like, and it loses the depth that should come with it. I'll have a future video where I talk about music being written or music in non-audio formats, and I will probably be coming back to this section of Harrison Bergeron to talk about the realness aspect of it. So look out for that. We've made it to the last page of the story, so I'm going to read it in full, uninterrupted. It is insane and perfect. So here we go. Harrison and his Empress merely listened to the music for a while, listened gravely, as though synchronizing their heartbeats with it. They shifted their weights to their toes. Harrison placed his big hands on the girl's tiny waist, letting her sense the weightlessness that would soon be hers. And then, in an explosion of joy and grace, into the air they sprang. Not only were the laws of the land abandoned, but the law of gravity and the laws of motion as well. They reeled, whirled, swiveled, flounced, capered, gambled, and spun. They leaped like deer on the moon. The studio ceiling was 30 feet high, but each leap brought the dancers nearer to it. It became their obvious intention to kiss the ceiling. They kissed it. And then, neutralizing gravity with love and pure will, they remained suspended in air inches below the ceiling. And they kissed each other for a long, long time. It was then that Diana Moon Glampers, the handicapper general, came into the studio with a double-barreled 10-gauge shotgun. She fired twice, and the Emperor and the Empress were dead before they hit the floor. Diana Moon Glampers loaded the gun again. She aimed it at the musicians and told them they had 10 seconds to get their handicaps back on. It was then that the Bergerons' television tube burned out. Hazel turned to comment about the blackout to George, but George had gone into the kitchen for a can of beer. George came back in with the beer, paused while a handicap signal shook him up, and then he sat down again. "You've been crying," he said to Hazel. "Yup," she said. "What about?" he said. "I forget," she said. "Something real sad on television." "What was it?" he said. "It's all kind of mixed up in my mind," said Hazel. "Forget sad things," said George. "I always do," said Hazel. "That's my girl," said George. He winced. There was the sound of a riveting gun in his head. "Gee, I could tell that one was a doozy," said Hazel. "You can say that again," said George. "Gee," said Hazel. "I could tell that one was a doozy." And that is the end of Kurt Vonnegut's Harrison Bergeron. A glimpse of hope in a dark, desolate world is snuffed out on live television, and nobody, not even that hope's parents, are able to care. Hazel has numbed herself to the point where she can't pay attention and actively forgets sad things, and George, who maybe can understand, was gone getting himself a beer. Sad things are incredibly important to life, even though they suck, because they're how we learn and how we grow. So, of course, this world wants everyone to forget sad things, because when everything is fine, everyone grows complacent because nothing needs to change. As for George, of course he's getting a beer, because that's the classic stereotype for a dad who doesn't, or in this case, can't pay attention. Also, if you think it's peculiar that a government so hell-bent on removing freedoms would allow alcohol to still exist, please remember that alcohol is poison that makes you stupid, and the government loves that. In Harrison's world, and in ours, everyone is so distracted all the time, and sometimes it isn't their choice, but sometimes it is. We are actively witnessing the death of sincerity and depth because we are devaluing our own attention so heavily. Harrison was the opposite of that. He forced people to focus, to listen, and to improve themselves for just one shining moment. And for that, he's the hero of this story despite only being in it for one page. Harrison is not necessarily statured as a hero just because of what he possesses, but rather how he uses these gifts to progress society. In fact, Harrison is almost described as a monster when all we know of him is his raw potential power, and it is only when he shows us his defiance that this good light begins to shine on him. Exercising his individuality puts him above people, but he says that when other people exercise theirs, they too will be lifted up and made dukes, barons, and earls. What this is saying is that you, as an individual with unique skills, talents, and traits, gain your personal power from expressing your uniqueness. You can thrive by being yourself and not lowering yourself to societal or anyone else's standards. That is an incredible analogy, and it is so very true and so very real. Harrison has such great ambition that he literally breaks the laws of physics, because that's what belief can do in a world where nobody believes anything. That's what you can do, that's what I can do, but that's not what anybody's doing because it's hard. I think we can take our power back as people if we all work hard enough to do it together. But the powers that be have so many people convinced that it isn't even worth trying. The easiest way to force people to stop trying to fix a problem is to tell them that there is no problem. And that's what they've done in Harrison Bergeron, that's what they've done in real life, that's where George and Hazel are, and that's where you and I are. Here's the thing about this story. Real life accessibility measures are a good thing. Nobody's arguing against that. It's a simple principle. It's good to lift people up, it's bad to bring them down. That's the principle this story operates on, and it does so by perverting this idea. Vonnegut isn't arguing that equality is bad, but he is arguing that there is a wrong way to do it. It is a massive misconception that individuality and community are ideas that are somehow at odds with each other. Some people are stuck asking, do I value myself first? Do I value my place in this community first? When really their place in any given community is first found within their true identity as an individual. I don't think anyone can be faulted for making that misconception because honestly, I think most people are too judgmental now for any other assumption to be made, but that judgment comes from other people judging each other, and if we just stop doing it, then we're free. It is a horrible tragedy of human existence that we can't try everything, know everything, perfect everything. I talked about this pretty recently with a poet friend of mine, and we both agreed that if we could live forever, what we would dedicate our eternal lives to is to learning. We'd never stop going to school, getting degrees, exploring new ideas, trades, cultures, but we can't. We can't do that, because we're not going to live forever. We have, if we're lucky, the better part of a century to live, right? And in that time, you can only ever be one person, and that's yourself. You may not know exactly who you are. There are certainly days where I don't feel like I do, but I do know with a 100% guarantee that you should not trust me to build a bridge for 1,000 cars to cross every day. You also probably shouldn't sit me down and make me do your taxes. But you could ask me to write you a little something, or maybe cook something a little for you, or identify a song based off of one note because I heard it in the Dillards at a mall one time when I was 8. Because those are the things that I can do. Those are the things that I'm good at. What can you do? I don't know. But trust me, I would love to find out. And I would love to show you that I value and appreciate those things for no other reason than I value as a person. I value you as a person because you are a person. I value your time. I respect you and the things that you care about enough to not shunt those things over to a robot. I understand I could never build a bridge. I understand I will probably never play like a great guitar solo. I understand I could probably never teach a classroom full of kindergartners, but you know why I'm totally okay with these facts? Because I have faith in the people who can, the people who do every day and have for centuries, because they're people, and for no other necessary fact. I value community. Purely and simply, and that means that I value each individual that makes up my community. Let's take a look at something Kurt Vonnegut, author of Harrison Bergeron, the short story we read about an hour ago now, once said on this note. I work at home, and if I wanted to, I could have a computer right by my bed, and I'd never have to leave it. But I use a typewriter, and afterward I mark up the pages with a pencil. Then I call up this woman named Carol out in Woodstock and say, "Are you still doing typing?" She sure is. And her husband is trying to track bluebirds out there and not having much luck. And so we chit-chat back and forth, and I say, "Okay, I'll send you the pages." Then I go down the steps and my wife calls, "Where are you going?" "Well," I say, "I'm going to buy an envelope." And she says, "You're not a poor man. Why don't you buy 1,000 envelopes? They'll deliver them and you can put them in the closet." And I say, "Hush." So I go to this newsstand across the street where they sell magazines and lottery tickets and stationery. I have to get in line because there are people buying candy and all that sort of thing, and I talk to them. The woman behind the counter has a jewel between her eyes, and when it's my turn, I ask her if there have been any big winners lately. I get my envelope and seal it up and go to the Postal Convenience Center down the block at the corner of 47th Street and 2nd Avenue, where I'm secretly in love with the woman behind the counter. I keep absolutely poker-faced. I never let her know how I feel about her. One time I had my pocket picked in there and got to meet a cop and tell him all about it. Anyway, I addressed the envelope to Carol in Woodstock. I stamp the envelope and mail it in a mailbox in front of the post office, and I go home. And I've had a hell of a good time. I tell you, we are here on Earth to fart around, and don't let anybody tell you any different. Not everyone lives in a community where this type of adventure and personability is available, and unfortunately, a lot of things have become much less accessible in our world since he said this, but I still found it relevant because community is always going to be important. This quote has really changed the way I feel about a lot of things, and sometimes in my head, like whenever I'm like, oh gosh, I don't really want to do this, but like I don't really want to go out and do this, I think we're on Earth to fart around. And then I go and do it. And I'm an anxious mess about it, and I probably mess up most of the social cues, but I did it. Now, I'm not going to pretend to have the ability to say anything better than Kurt Vonnegut could, so we're just going to have to ignore him for the rest of the video so that I can feel less cripplingly inadequate. Not really, of course, as our third short story today is all about this same sentiment. Our next and last short story of the day comes from Arthur C. Clarke, and has a title that might have been the name of my second edition D&D campaign if I was born in the 70s like I stupidly used to believe I was supposed to be. The 9 Billion Names of God is another fun-sized one, coming in at only around 5 pages. It was originally written in 1953 by Arthur C. Clarke, who you may know as the author of 2001: A Space Odyssey. Clarke is the person whose work here today I am least familiar with, but I feel like I should be reading more because his concepts and some of the excerpts of praise at the top of this PDF seem kind of awesome. He does make some funky choices that kind of bug me, but we'll get there, I guess. This story has the least direct relevance, but it really struck a chord with me and spoke to some fears that have been rising up in and around me for a few years now. I first heard about this story from YouTuber Quinn's Ideas, who has a great video on this, but I'm going to be taking my analysis in a bit of a different direction, and it's been a couple months since I watched that video, so hopefully I'm not repeating any of the things that he has to say. This is a slightly unusual request, said Dr. Wagner with what he hoped was condemnable restraint. As far as I know, it's the first time anyone's been asked to supply a Tibetan monastery with an automated sequence computer. I don't wish to be inquisitive, but I should hardly have thought that your establishment had much use for such a machine. Could you explain just what you intend to do with it? Gladly, replied the Lama, readjusting his silk robes and carefully putting away the slide rule he had been using for currency conversions. Your Mark V computer can carry out any routine mathematical operation involving up to 10 digits. However, for our work, we are interested in the letters, not numbers. As we wish you to modify the output circuits, the machine will be printing columns of words, not figures. I don't quite understand. This is a project on which we have been working for the last 3 centuries, since the Lamasery was founded, in fact. It is somewhat alien to your way of thought, so I hope you will listen with an open mind while I explain it. Naturally. It is really quite simple. We have been compiling a list which shall contain all the possible names of God. I am in. There's an old storytelling rule, which is kind of a new storytelling rule, I guess, in grand scheme of things. But anyway, it says that you should start your story at the latest possible moment, and then use a more natural approach to give the exposition and the backstory in the middle of the scene that you're in. Nothing tells us we are here with a mechanical engineer and a lama of a Tibetan monastery. We just are in their conversation. Everything gets told to us naturally. This is a banger intro. It's so good. Already we can tell the story has a great sense of efficiency just narratively, but it's thematically important too, as we'll come to find out. For that reason, and because of its relatively short length, I'm going to be reading a lot directly and doing even less paraphrasing than I did last time. We have reason to believe, continued the Lama imperturbably, that all such names can be written with not more than 9 letters in an alphabet we have devised. And you've been doing this for 3 centuries? Yes. We expected it would take us about 15,000 years to complete the task. Oh. Dr. Wagner looked a little dazed. Now I see why you wanted to hire one of our machines. But exactly what is the purpose of this project? The Lama hesitated for a fraction of a second, and Wagner wondered if he had offended him. If so, there was no trace of annoyance in the reply. Call it ritual if you like, but it's a fundamental part of our belief. All the many names of the Supreme Being, God, Jehovah, Allah, and so on, they are only man-made labels. There is a philosophical problem of some difficulty here, which I do not propose to discuss. But somewhere along all the possible combinations of letters that can occur are what one may call the real names of God. By systematic permutation, we have been trying to list them all. I see. You've been starting at A, and working up to Z, 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 Z. Exactly. Though we use a special alphabet of our own. Modifying the electromagnetic typewriters to deal with this is, of course, trivial. A rather more interesting problem is that of devising suitable circuits to eliminate ridiculous combinations. For instance, no letter must occur more than 3 times in succession. 3? Surely you mean 2. 3 is correct. I am afraid it would take too long to explain why, even if you understood our language. I'm sure would, said Wagner hastily. Go on. Luckily, it will be a simple matter to adapt your automated sequence computer for this work, since once it has been programmed properly, it will permute each letter in turn and print the result. What would have taken us 15,000 years, it will be able to do in 100 days. This lamasery, which is a new word I learned from this story, has had this task of listing every possible logical name of God for the last 3 centuries. I think that their goal will take them 15,000 years, and so they want to shorten it using this automated sequence computer's algorithm. This seems simple, cut and dry almost, but we can tell by the llama's hesitation and haziness that there's likely something going on under the surface that we don't know yet. Maybe something we can't know. Dr. Wagner seems to understand this on some level because he responds to this in a daze or hastily, eager to fully uncover the task set out before him, and this makes sense. He very likely sees himself as out of his own depth already, but the reluctance the llama shows to fully explaining the lower workings puts him on edge. I'm actually not too sure what I would do here. On one hand, if this prominent religious figure tells me that I probably won't understand something about his culture, I'll just believe him. I don't want to pry or be disrespectful. But on the other hand, as a business person and scientist, there's a certain ethical obligation towards knowing the exact goal you're working towards. If you look at great scientists in history, they all get horribly upset when their research goes towards something they don't want, like a weapon, for example. So, if I'm Wagner here, I'm asking more questions. I don't really care if it's offensive. Listing all the possible names would be great, but then what? Where do you go from there? What do you gain? Having a list of all of the possible names results in so many results that you may as well not list them, as it would feel just as tangible. So what's really going on here? Well, to Wagner, nothing. I kind of forgot that some people think other people are stupid, and I didn't take that into my account of what I would do next. So I was super wrong about my prediction, but here's what Wagner does. Dr. Wagner was scarcely conscious of the faint sounds coming from the Manhattan streets far below. He was in a different world, a world of natural, not man-made mountains. High up in their remote areas, these monks had been patiently at work, generation after generation, compiling their lists of meaningless words. Was there any limit to the follies of mankind? Still, he must give no hint of his inner thoughts. The customer was always right. Wagner sees no real point in the llama's request besides the money he's going to be paid for it. His act, his decision to help, is not from any place of empathy or compassion or even curiosity, just greed. Sure, this isn't a huge sin or anything. Well, greed is a huge sin, but not this specific instance. He's an engineer looking to make use of his invention, and here's an opportunity. I think the real problem stems from the fact that he's not just dismissive of the llama's ideas, but internally condescending about them. He, the man of technology, has placed himself intellectually above the man of spirituality, and this is important for looking at the dynamics that this story will display. Because the rest of this story is told through the third-person perspective of the engineers, this is the standpoint that the rest of the story builds itself off of. This narrative that the engineers are intellectually above the monks. There's no doubt, replied the doctor, that we can modify the Mark V to print lists of this nature. I'm much more worried about the problem of installation and maintenance. Getting out to Tibet in these days is not going to be easy. We can arrange that. The components are small enough to travel by air. That is one reason we chose your machine. If you can get them to India, we will provide transport from there. So, I am not the biggest history guy. I am not super familiar with Tibetan history or culture, so I had to look some stuff up here. From what I gathered, in the late 40s to early 50s, there was a lot of uncertainty as to who had sovereignty over Tibet, and eventually the People's Republic of China sent the People's Liberation Army into Tibet. After 2 weeks of fighting, thousands of Tibetan forces surrendered to the PRC because they were significantly less militarized. Then the PRC gained sovereignty over Tibet after some slightly dubious agreements. Over the course of the next few years, there would be a lot of turmoil, which would lead to revolt. Tensions were high throughout the entire decade, but especially towards the beginning and end, and it would have been especially hard to just fly right in, as Dr. Wagner says. Another interesting implication here is that there are multiple machines capable of doing what Wagner's machine can do, because the llama says it's a reason we chose your machine. Keep this idea in your back pocket, please. It will be useful later. Wagner and the llama keep talking, and it's revealed that 2 engineers are being hired for this task. Does anybody want to take a guess at what one of them will be named? There are so many names in the world. 9 billion names for God, millions of names for people, for just regular dudes. The llama shows Wagner how much money he's going to give him, and Wagner calls the amount, adequate. Which I think means it's a ridiculous high number, and he's just trying to keep cool. Wagner asks if there's a sufficient power source available at the Lamasery, and there is a 50 kilowatt generator that's been quite reliably powering the prayer wheels. I looked up what prayer wheels are. They're really cool. It's interesting technology. It's interesting looking. Wagner says, in response to the generator, I should have thought about that, of course, which I took in a sarcastic and patronizing way. Now the story skips ahead in time to when the engineers arrive at the Lamasery. The view from the parapet was vertiginous, but in time one gets used to anything. After 3 months, George Hanley was not impressed by the 2,000-foot swoop into the abyss or the remote checkerboard of fields in the valley below. He was leaning against the wind-smooth stones and staring morosely at the distant mountains whose names he had never bothered to discover. Third George of the day. That's gotta be a feat somewhere. And this one is only 1 letter away from the first George's full name. This George, like the others, has no sense of whimsy because he doesn't really care about the environment he's been in for a while. I'm imagining like a Barbie Land thing now, but with like a bunch of different Georges in horrible sci-fi landscapes. Like these horrible science fiction hellscapes of their own. George Land. I'll call it George Land. It's not nearly as fun. You got George from the Veldt over here, and his house is terrible. And then you got George from Harrison Bergeron, and his house is fine, but he can't pay attention to anything, and his life sucks. Then you got George from 9 Billion Names, and I mean, his house is great. He's got a beautiful landscape, good lawn. He just doesn't care about it, and he hates his job, and some other stuff happens too, which I'm taking this too far. Let's go back. This, thought George, was the craziest thing that had ever happened to him. Project Shangri-La, some wit back at the labs had christened it. For weeks now, the Mark V had been churning out acres of sheets covered with gibberish. Patiently, inexorably, the computer had been rearranging letters in all their possible combinations, exhausting each class before going on to the next. As the sheets had emerged from the electromatic typewriters, the monks had carefully cut them up and pasted them into enormous books. In just another week, heaven be praised, they would have finished. Just what obscure calculations had convinced the monks that they needn't bother to go on words of 10, 20, or 100 letters, George didn't know. One of his recurring nightmares was that there would be some change of plan, and that the High Lama, whom they naturally called Sam Jaff, even though he didn't look a bit like him, would suddenly announce that the project had been extended to approximately AD 2060. They were quite capable of it. Sam Jaff, I hope I'm saying that right, is an old actor. I know him from The Day the Earth Stood Still, which is a great movie. He plays the scientist in that movie. And he's a very unique looking dude. So the story saying that the High Lama doesn't look like him does not help at all. The real point to hold on to here, though, is that George is bored. He no longer feels any fulfillment with this task, if he ever did, and really dreads it going on for any longer. This monotony he's dealing with will be important. George heard the heavy wooden door slam in the wind as Chuck came out onto the parapet beside him. As usual, Chuck was smoking one of the cigars that made him so popular with the monks, who, it seemed, were quite willing to embrace all the minor and most of the major pleasures of life. That was one thing in their favor. They might be crazy, but they weren't blue noses. Those frequent trips they took down to the village, for instance. So these monks don't abide by stereotypical Hollywood monk rules. They can have attachments and pleasures, and this behavior is accepted and even praised by George, who calls it one of the only good things about them. In real life, practicing Buddhists, even monks, don't always follow this no attachment rule. As with all religions, there are varying sects with their own rules. However, we should look at the monks in this story through the lens of how they were written to be perceived at the time. In the 50s, there was certainly a popular idea of Tibet and of Buddhist monks, and we can tell by using this zeitgeist and by the language in this past paragraph that most people would read the word monk and the strict picture would form in their head. Clark deliberately plants this idea so that he can subvert it, making it surprising to both George and the reader. This does raise a question though, one that the reader asks but George does not. Why, if these monks are so dedicated to their cause that they're willing to bring in foreign engineers, are they acting without care towards their religion's rules? What circumstances or planned events would have to be in place for someone to disregard the idea of future punishment or believe themselves to be above that punishment? Listen, George, said Chuck urgently. I've learned something that means trouble. What's wrong? Isn't the machine behaving? That was the worst contingency George could imagine. It might delay his return, and nothing could be more horrible. The way he felt now, even the sight of a TV commercial would seem like manna from heaven. At least it would be some link with home. No, it's nothing like that. Chuck settled himself on the parapet, which was unusual because normally he was scared of the drop. I've just found out what this is all about. Sure, we know what the monks are trying to do, but we don't know why. It's the craziest thing. Tell me something new, growled George. But old Sam's just come clean with me. You know the way he drops in every afternoon to watch the sheets roll out? Well, this time he seemed rather excited, or at least as near as he'll ever get to it. When I told him that we were on the last cycle, he asked me in that cute English accent of his if I'd ever wondered what they were trying to do. I said sure, and he told me. Go on, I'll buy it. Well, they believe that when they've listed all his names, and they reckon that there are about 9 billion of them, God's purpose will have been achieved. The human race will have finished what it was created to do, and there won't be any point in carrying on. Indeed, the very idea is something like blasphemy. Then what do they expect us to do? Commit suicide? There's no need for that. When the list's completed, God steps in and simply winds things up. Bingo. Oh, I get it. When we finish our job, it'll be the end of the world. Everybody, please say hello to our conflict. Apparently, when all 9 billion names of God have been produced, God steps in and ends the world. The idea is that if humanity has reached a point where they're able to produce all of these names, then they've reached a point where they're as advanced as they could possibly ever need to be, or as advanced as they were designed to be. This is where that old fear of mine comes in. I, for years, have felt like technology's goal is to increase the speed at which we evolve. I'm afraid that at a certain point we will innovate past our any need for innovation. We will have out-innovated ourselves, made ourselves obsolete for the sake of what? Convenience? These monks have dedicated centuries to their task, and now suddenly they just want it to be over already. And when it ends, apparently the world goes with it. The monks are proven right in their thinking because if a technology exists that makes their task easier, then humans have done enough. I'm afraid that if humanity actually did have an end goal, a specified one, we'd race towards it because over-eagerness is an inherent human trait. We wouldn't consider what completing this might mean. We'd just do it. I ushered in this story with the Vonnegut quote about messing around because I think this story has such a similar idea, or at least it makes me think that it does. The monks have a purpose, they have for centuries, and they were supposed to keep having it for more and more centuries, but technology took it away and they were happy about it. I think this is happening with so many people now. Maybe it's that people are amazed with the idea that tech can replace them, so they let it. Maybe it's that we've created a system in which we're so goal-oriented and profit-oriented in the first place that we're willing to give up everything in order to complete just one more thing. I wrote a short story myself a couple years ago about a Lovecraftian-type beast that rises from the ocean and starts wreaking havoc. Did all the usual stuff, making people go insane, start hurting themselves and others, roaring, screaming, all that. It caused hundreds of deaths and damage to the natural environment that could never be fixed, and then in a single blow, it died. Human military innovations had reached a point so much further than even an ancient god could comprehend. These gods could speak in incomprehensible tongues, boil oceans with their anger, command thousands of minds at a time, and so many more things, but humans can split an atom in half. And what do they do with this power? This power that could cleanly, power the entire world if propaganda and manufactured disasters hadn't ruined the idea in everyone's head. Well, they kill and destroy. I had not read or even heard of the 9 billion names of God when I wrote this story, but I felt the same things reading 9 billion names that I did when I was writing my story. My story is nowhere near as good as this one. I don't think it's as nuanced or anything really, but I like that I'm not the only person thinking things like this. If you guys are interested, I might narrate the story and put it on here or something. I'll have to make a lot of revisions I made some revisions recently, but you can still definitely tell that like a 19-year-old who's never taken a writing class wrote it. But I think improved a lot since then. I still like the general concepts and some of the prose, so maybe I will. Maybe I'll do that if you guys are interested. Anyway, that's enough about me. Chuck gave a nervous little laugh. That's what I said to Sam, and you know what happened? He looked at me in a very queer way, like I'd been stupid in class, and said, "It's nothing as trivial as that." George thought this over for a moment. "That's what I call taking the wide view," he said presently. "What do you suppose we do about it? I don't see that it makes the slightest difference to us. After all, we already knew they were crazy." "Yes, but don't you see what may happen? When the list's complete and the last trump doesn't blow, or whatever it is they expect, we may get the blame. It's our machine they've been using. I don't like the situation one little bit." "I see," said George slowly. "You've got a point there. But this sort of thing's happened before, you know. When I was a kid, down in Louisiana, we had a crackpot preacher who once said the world was going to end next Sunday. Hundreds of people believed him, even sold their homes. Yet, when nothing happened, they didn't turn nasty as you'd expect. They just decided he'd made a mistake in his calculations and went right on believing. I guess some of them still do." When presented with the idea of what might happen when their task is complete, George and Chuck don't fully take it to heart. How could they? How could anybody? The world ending when certain words get written, that's not very scientifically plausible, is it? These are men of science, of fact. How could they even think about this idea for longer than a second? Why do they think about it at all? Chuck laughs nervously, and George thinks things over and talks slowly. George grew up in a church, and although it sounds like he now resents it, there's a seed of belief in him. He thinks it's foolish that the monks and the families who sold their houses are blind in a way, but he tells this story with hesitation. When I was in 7th grade, I had a friend whose house I'd go to pretty much every weekend, sometimes even like during the week. He and I were best friends, but we had a very fundamental disagreement about one thing. My friend very strictly believed in ghosts. He would watch ghost hunting videos on YouTube and watch like ghost adventures and stuff on TV. And I did not. I still don't believe in ghosts. I don't think that they're real. They just don't make sense to me. But there was one time that we were playing flashlight tag, and it was time for me to find him. And I went down into his basement to look for him, even though I thought it was probably implausible that he was down there, because all the time that I had known him, he'd always talked about how his basement was super haunted, and how everything down there was cursed and terrible. And there was a room in the back. It was like a basement kind of garage that didn't have cars. It just had tools and stuff in it. I hope you know what I mean. And so I'm going down there. All the lights in the house are off because we're playing flashlight tag, and or I guess it was more like a hide and seek game. But I go downstairs, and there's kind of a sitting room, and then there's a bathroom, and then the door to the basement garage is on the other side. And I walk in to the living room, and I look to the right, and I see the bathroom door is open and the door to the basement garage is open. We have been instructed for the few years that I've known him to not go in there. That area is off limits. It is only for his dad. And I look in there, and I am paralyzed with fear. I am freezing cold from my toes up, and I know deep in my heart that that is a haunted area that I'm looking at, that a ghost has opened this door. And at the same time, I know that ghosts are not real. But because my friend implanted that idea in my head, there was a ghost there. Now, the thing that I'm getting at, the point that I'm getting at, is that I think Chuck and George are in a similar boat, where they know they're men of science, it's just words on a page. But what if? After this moment, I began to read the story with a completely different tone. I no longer see George and Chuck as stubborn, but rather as shaken, as defensive. Everything they say from this point on can be read as men trying to regain their composure, bulking up in the face of danger and of fear. Well, this isn't Louisiana, in case you hadn't noticed. There are just 2 of us and hundreds of these monks. I like them, and I'll be sorry for old Sam when his life work backfires on him, but all the same, I wish I was somewhere else. I've been wishing that for weeks, but there's nothing we can do until the contract's finished and the transport arrives to fly us out. Of course, said Chuck thoughtfully. We could always try a bit of sabotage. Like hell we could. That would make things worse. Not the way I meant. Look at it like this. The machine will finish its run 4 days from now, on the present 20 hours a day basis. The transport calls in a week. Okay, then all we need to do is find something that needs replacing during one of the overhaul periods. Something that will hold up the works for a couple of days. We'll fix it, of course, but not too quickly. If we time matters properly, we can be down at the airfield when the last name pops out of the register. They won't be able to catch us then. I don't like it, said George. It'd be the first time I ever walked out on a job. Besides, it would make them suspicious. No, I'll sit tight and take what comes. I still don't like it, he said 7 days later, as the tough little mountain ponies carried them down the winding road. And don't you think I'm running away because I'm afraid. I'm just sorry for those poor old guys up there, and I don't want to be around when they find out what suckers they've been. Wonder how Sam will take it. It's funny, replied Chuck, but when I said goodbye, I got the idea he knew we were walking out on him, and that he didn't care because he knew the machine was running smoothly, and that the job would soon be finished. After that, well, of course, for him there isn't any after that. George specifically reeks of fear and of defensiveness as they travel away from the Lamasery. Chuck is a little less obviously afraid, but more contemplative. I really love the capitalization of the words after that, framing this time as holy or important, much like one might capitalize the G in God or the H in him or his. George and Chuck keep going down the path, and George looks back at the Lamasery and sees the electric lights on. He wonders what the monks will do with the Mark V once they figure out that their work was for nothing, picturing them either smashing it or peacefully continuing their calculations on their own by hand. They continue down the path towards the plane that's going to take them home, which is a Douglas DC-3, an old, very 50s, kind of sleek-looking plane. We're basically at the end, so I'm going to read the last few paragraphs without further interruption. George knew exactly what was happening up on the mountain at this very moment. The High Lama and his assistants would be sitting in their silk robes, inspecting the sheets as the junior monks carried them away from the typewriters and pasted them into the great volumes. No one would be saying anything. The only sound would be the incessant patter, the never-ending rainstorm of the keys hitting the paper, for the Mark V itself was utterly silent as it flashed through its thousands of calculations a second. 3 months of this, thought George, was enough to start anyone climbing up the wall. There she is, called Chuck, pointing down into the valley. Ain't she beautiful? She certainly was, thought George. The battered old DC-3 lay at the end of the runway like a tiny silver cross. In 2 hours, she would be bearing them away to freedom and sanity. It was a thought worth savoring like a fine liqueur. George let it roll around his mind as the pony trudged patiently down the slope. The swift night of the high Himalayas was now almost upon them. Fortunately, the road was very good, as roads went in that region, and they were both carrying torches. There was not the slightest danger, only a certain discomfort from the bitter cold. The sky overhead was perfectly clear, and ablaze with the familiar, friendly stars. At least there would be no risk, thought George, of the pilot being unable to take off because of weather conditions. That had been his only remaining worry. He began to sing, but gave it up after a while. This vast arena of mountains, gleaming like whitely hooded ghosts on every side, did not encourage such ebullience. Presently, George glanced at his watch. Should be there in an hour, he called back over his shoulder to Chuck. Then he added in afterthought, wonder if the computer's finished its run. It was due about now. Chuck didn't reply, so George swung around in his saddle. He could see Chuck's face, a white oval turned toward the sky. Look, whispered Chuck, and George lifted his eyes to heaven. There was always a last time for everything. Overhead, without any fuss, the stars were going out. And that's that. I think it's an incredible ending and will definitely be going in my bag of answers if anybody ever asks me for what my favorite last lines are. I love the quietness and the acceptance of it. There's no fighting it, there's not even an attempt. It's just happening and there's no way around it. I think of this as a mix of things, one part showing us the enormity of the event and one part showing us the smallness of George, Chuck, and Dr. Wagner. The engineers are talkers and thinkers, outspoken in their beliefs or lack of beliefs. For the stars to go out without fuss, without show, without speech, it just shows that these men were going about things the wrong way the whole time. I also think it's wonderful that this event, which I'm going to call the quieting, happened immediately after the names were finished being generated and processed by the monks. There was no time to prepare except for the weeks and years leading up to this. but nobody knew. I will say I'm not sure how I feel about the line, "there is always a last time for everything," in parentheses. It feels redundant to me and like a big breakaway in tone. Nowhere else are the parentheses really used like that, and I honestly like reading it more if I ignore that line. Overall, though, I think this ending is just beyond fantastic. I think it perfectly wraps up the story in such a horrifyingly good way. I was never rooting for George. Honestly, the character I found myself liking the most was Sam, though he wasn't super present for most of it. I felt kind of endeared towards the monks in a weird way. There was a narrative fulfillment to the monks being right that I really appreciated, although the implications do terrify me. The fear that we're out-teching ourselves is one that I've expressed really weighs on me, and whether that be through the fantastic quieting or a real nuclear bomb, I feel very seen and very heard by this story. I said to keep in mind that the Mark V was only one of several machines that could execute the monks' plan. Knowing that the Mark V essentially ended the world due to how advanced it was is one thing, but knowing that it wasn't the only thing that could do that is a much, much bigger thing. I think it's crazy to believe that there were many, many methods to the actual apocalypse, and that's just counting the Buddhist one that Sam and the other monks enforced, but it's so real too. I think it's incredibly easy to be lost in fear when you're lost in technology too. What can you be except overwhelmed, uncertain, and insecure when you lack control or agency over seemingly everything around you? Who are you when your individuality is stripped for conformity and general comfort? How can you live knowing that technology exists that is supposedly slingshotting us rapidly towards our own destruction? Well, you're just you. You wake up and you go to sleep every day and night, knowing that whether it seems like it or not, you are part of something bigger, a community of real people. These real people have their own skills, traits, and personalities that make community so powerful and so important. By reclaiming our place in communities and pushing ourselves to be something more than a piece in a technological nightmare machine, we regain so much power and so much potential. I feel bad I've talked about such terrifying stories and talked about how they relate to our real world without saying much of this, but living and thriving in an environment that sounds like it comes from a sci-fi story is so much more than possible. You have yourself and we all have each other. When everything else seems like it's out of control, please remember that. Do you know the one thing that all these stories have in common besides the technological dread? Nobody in these stories tries to help anyone else in small moments, and there's no love to be found. That's why these worlds are doomed, because the people give up. They stop loving each other and stop caring about each other or even themselves. Now, Harrison Bergeron is a slight exception because he's being directly oppressed by a radical government, but that is hyperbole. And the real risk that comes with simply being there for one another is zero. In times like this, in worlds like this, you may ask, how am I supposed to have hope? Why should I even try? And my answer is because you have to. Hope is the one thing that gets us through everything. Hope is what makes us survive. If you're like me and you're tired of the artificial, the over-teched, and it seems like there's no way out, let me tell you, the only way out is through, and the only way through is to keep going. You'll find hope along the way, and when we pull ourselves out from being lost like the characters in these stories are, we heal and we prevail together. It may not be simple, but it is worth trying, because as I always tell myself and the people that I love, if things are going to get better, we do not have another choice but to hope. I'd say more on this topic, but I don't think I need to. It's really deceptively simple. With that being said, I would love to have any conversation about this in the comments, and I would like to really just encourage you to believe in yourselves as powerful and individual people. Everyone has immense potential within themselves for no other reason than the fact that they are a person. Everyone has talents, everyone has skills, everyone has so many reasons to stay hopeful in a world that seems like it doesn't want us to hope. The way to win is to continue to be ourselves and to continue to be hopeful. So please, by any means necessary, keep hoping. Keep helping one another, keep loving one another, and keep loving yourselves. Thank you all for watching. This has been 3 short stories about dudes named George, and if you enjoyed it, please let me know, whether that be through leaving a like, subscribing, or leaving a comment telling me how good I am and nothing else. No, I'm joking. I would definitely appreciate some constructive criticism, as this is the first solo YouTube video I've made since I was probably 12 years old, and I would imagine that the last thing I made on YouTube was probably like a fake Herobrine sighting or something. So Not super comparable. I've got a lot more videos in the works, so be on the lookout for those too. I think the next one is going to be about the specific importance of poetry and why we should all be seeking more of it. There are a lot of varied topics I've got written down that I'm excited to write about and talk about though, so if you don't totally hate my voice or my face or something, I would love to have you back. Thank you again. I hope to see you later, and stay hopeful.